Chapter 2597. The Jindan cultivators in the discussion hall did not think as far as LV Ruochang. From the various signs, it was clear that the sword cultivators were truly defeated, and it was not a trap like some of the Jindan cultivators were worried about. As such, every single Jindan cultivator in the discussion hall gathered their strength and urged their disciples to chase after the sword cultivators. They wanted to end this battle with the sword cultivators in the sword tomb. In addition, after the surviving Jindan cultivators in the discussion hall heard about Qianmo's self-destruction, they also felt a sense of sorrow in their hearts. Actually, Qianmo, Yuan Zhongyu, and Ji Hong could have escaped that day. However, Qianmo chose this path himself. It was a path of no return. How could they not sigh? These Jindan cultivators were all heavenly geniuses, and all of them had ambitions in their hearts. However, they were currently in a dangerous situation, and it was as though they were treading on thin ice. If they were not careful, they could lose their lives at any moment. Not to mention their ambitions, their dreams were all about to turn into smoke. As such, the words that Qianmo said before his death were deeply acknowledged by them. The confusion, ridicule, and mockery towards Qianmo had all disappeared, and a trace of faintly discernible respect was born in their hearts. That's right. Who could clearly differentiate whether a person was good or bad? How could a person be determined by a single word or sentence? The bad that Xiaohua thought was not bad. The good that De Sun thought was not good. The bad that Daoist Shuiyu thought was not bad. The good that everyone worshipped might not be good either. Perhaps there was no such thing as good or bad in a human. No one would be able to differentiate between good and bad. Speaking of which, the Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain who was hiding in the sword tomb did not know that the sword cultivators were defeated. As they approached the sword tomb, the hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators also chased after them. Xiaohua, who was hiding in the small house, naturally did not know either. He was currently like the tens of thousands of cultivators, wholeheartedly comprehending the so-called secret technique of the Yu family, and researching how to combine this secret technique with the sword arts of the sword cultivators. However, the difference was that while the tens of thousands of cultivators were dreaming of turning stone into gold, Xiaohua had already treated this dream as a golden millet. On this day, a male cultivator who was not very tall quietly entered the sword tomb. This male cultivator's face was flat, and his nose, mouth, and other things were stuck to his face. Moreover, his eyes were not of a normal size, and there were several large tumors on his forehead. In particular, there were a few clumps of black hair growing on the tumor. It looked really indecent. This male cultivator was at the early stage of foundation establishment. His movements were vigorous, and he was also proficient in the art of flight. With a jade slip in his hand, he easily bypassed the formations and sword formations within the sword mound, arriving at the Zigui where Xiaohua had met Yuping that day. However, the male cultivator threw the jade slip into Zigui with great familiarity. The stone touch token flashed inside Zigui and disappeared like a meteor. The male cultivator let out a sigh of relief and looked around. There was a hint of worry on his face. Not long after, Yuping flew over with a smile on her face and said from afar, "Yudong, you're finally back." Greetings, sixth uncle. This early foundation establishment cultivator was actually Yudong. It's that Yudong who recommended Xiaohua. Moreover, this Yudong was actually a rare stutterer among cultivators. Yuping was probably already used to Yudong's stuttering. Seeing that he had already finished bowing and hadn't finished his respectful words, Yuping nodded and said, "Get up. We haven't seen each other for several years. Your cultivation seems to have made some progress." It's at Nanping. Nanping Mountain. There's some at this point he actually couldn't continue, as if something was stuck in his throat. "That's right, this is your opportunity." Yuping didn't pay attention and said with a smile, "The heavens are the fairest. Seeing that you're bitterly cultivating, they gave you an opportunity. You must properly grasp it." "Yes," Yudong said this word very smoothly, as if he was already used to saying it. "Let's go." Yuping waved his hand and flew up saying, "This Zigui is new and you're not familiar with it. Follow this old man back to Fanjin Palace and find a quiet room to cultivate. Don't disappoint the heavens." Yes, yes, nephew. Understands. Hearing this, Yudong's heart was filled with gratitude, and he couldn't help but stutter again. Seeing the flush on Yudong's face and the joy in his eyes, Yuping's gaze was also kind, and even a little bit tender. The corner of his mouth curled up into a smile, and he said while flying, "The day after tomorrow will be the last batch of cultivators to enter the palace for the Midas touch. These past few years, you haven't completed the sect master's task." This old man has also mentioned this to Senior Yu Bing several times. He also knows about your difficulties, so he didn't rush you, and even covered it up for you in front of the sect master. However, the recommendation of cultivators is an absolute order from the sect master. No matter who it is, they have to recommend a few foundation establishment cultivators. Yes, yes, nephew is ashamed. Yudong's face flushed red, and his eyes flashed with panic. Sect masters. Punishment. Yuping naturally wouldn't wait for Yudong to finish speaking, and he smiled. However, you were able to recommend an early foundation establishment cultivator at the most critical moment, and it seems that his aptitude is also very good. This old man has already told Senior Yu Bing that you've completed the sect master's task. When you return to Fanjin Palace, you must first pay a visit to Senior Yu Bing and thank him for his grace. Only then can you calm down. No. No, Yudong had already said no more than 10 times behind Yuping, but Yuping didn't care. He continued to fly as he spoke. Moreover, he was flying slightly faster. When Yudong used all his strength to fly behind Yuping, he grabbed Yuping's Taoist robe. Yudong couldn't say no. What's wrong? Yuping smiled. Although you've only recommended one person, but with your eloquence, it's really rare. This person is equivalent to 10 of them. No, Yudong was really anxious, and his face was almost covered in sweat, and the veins on his forehead were popping out. Seeing that Yuping was also at a loss, Yudong hurriedly took out a jade slip, and immersed his spiritual sense in it, and quickly handed it to Yuping. Yuping frowned as he received it, and when he finished reading it, he was shocked. What? You didn't recommend a cultivator at all? Yes. Yudong was very familiar with this word. But, if you didn't recommend him, then who recommended Feng from the Huanhua sect? Yuping was a little flustered, and he asked anxiously. Yudong shook his head vigorously, indicating that he didn't know Feng at all. But he used your stone striking token. It was your earliest stone striking token. Yuping still didn't give up, and said anxiously. Among the disciples of the Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain, only you haven't returned for many years, and only you have the route of the stone striking token. Yudong didn't say much, and with a clap of his hands, he took out a jade slip and handed it to Yuping. Yuping's spiritual sense entered it, and his face was really ashen. This is your stone striking token. It's really the one you didn't use for a long time, but that day. Senior brother Yubing. Why did you say it was your stone striking token? Yuping was also stunned. The Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain knew that the blood sacrifice they had performed in the Sword Tomb was a matter that angered both men and gods, so how would they dare to let others know? In these few decades, 100,000 cultivators had died in the Sword Tomb for no reason, and it was more serious than the Great Battle of Dao cultivators, so how could it not attract the attention of others? However, among these 100,000 cultivators, most of them were cultivators below the Qi refinement stage, and the majority were itinerant cultivators. Therefore, although the Great Battle of Dao cultivators had attracted the attention of some forces, after the battle began, everyone's attention was on the battle, and this matter was forgotten. However, if people really found out about the Yu family's plan, then Yuping also knew that this would be the beginning of the Yu family's destruction, even if Yu Qingtian didn't say so. Thinking of this, and looking at Yudong, who was so anxious that his forehead was sweating, Yuping was also trembling in mid-air. What should I do? Yuping's mind was in a fierce struggle. Needless to say, this was definitely a mistake made by Yubing. As for where the mistake was made, Yuping wasn't clear, and it was too late to find out what the mistake was. Yuping could naturally push this matter to Yubing. However, who was Yubing? He was Yuping's senior brother who was very close to him. Yuping was able to mingle in the Yu family to this extent because of Yubing's care. If it was Yuhua's mistake, Yuping would have jumped up long ago, and there would be no need for him to think about it. However, Yu Bing couldn't do it, and Yu Ping couldn't expose it. Moreover, although it was Yu Bing's order to bring Xiao Hua into the Brahma Gold Palace, Yu Ping didn't carefully inspect Xiao Hua's token. Moreover, when he entered the palace, he even quarreled with the disciple who was inspecting him. Of course, even if Xiao Hua's token wasn't wrong, and even if Yu Ping didn't think that Xiao Hua didn't have the token of the cleansing flower sect, he was the one who brought Xiao Hua in. And no matter how he tried to clear himself of this responsibility, it was impossible. However, in just a short moment, Yu Ping calmed down, and a confident smile appeared on his face. 666. Seeing Yu Ping's panic disappear, and a smile appeared on his face, Yu Dong was stunned, and he hurriedly pulled on Yu Ping's robe to ask. However, the more anxious he became, the more he stuttered, and he actually said 6 times in a row, but he was still unable to say uncle. Dong, don't be anxious. Yu Ping naturally knew what Yu Dong was thinking, and he patted Yu Dong's shoulder with a smile. This matter has nothing to do with you, it is this old man's negligence. No, this word was resolute, and Yu Dong took out a blank jade letter, wrote something on it, and passed it to Yu Ping. Ah! After Yu Ping saw it, a smile appeared on his face, and he said, "This child, what did you say about going to the sect head to admit your mistake? You even want to ask for this old man's forgiveness. What's the point of bringing up such a matter? As long as you have such intentions, this old man will be satisfied, and this old man will not have taken care of you in vain." Chapter 2598. Immediately, Yu Ping pulled Yu Dong and said as they flew, "Actually, the situation is not as serious as you think. The Huanhua Sect's foundation establishment disciple called Fengying has been arranged by this old man to stay in the cultivation nest. You also know that the cultivation nest is the most important place in the Brahma Golden Palace. It is completely controlled by the sect leader's Silver Tiger. Without a cultivation level above the Golden Core stage and special abilities, it is impossible to escape from there." Yes. Although Yu Dong stuttered, how could a foundation establishment cultivator be so stupid? Yu Ping only needed to point it out, and he understood. The panic on his face lessened, and he answered with a single word. "No matter what mission Fengying came here for. Since he is here, he can forget about going back. In the past, our Brahma Golden Palace has had disciples from the Huanhua sect. Since they can recommend him, why can't we?" Yu Ping gritted his teeth and said, "Moreover, when Fengying entered the cultivation nest, the sect leader also knew. This old man said that he was recommended by you and he did not say anything. You don't have to say anything now." "Yes." Yu Dong nodded. "You must be sure today that no matter who comes to ask you, this Fengying was recommended by you. As for how you met him and how you recommended him, only you know. If you want to say it, say it. If you don't want to say it, no one will force you. This old man can be sure that no one will ask." Yu Ping said, "Even if there is a mistake in the end and the sect leader wants to take responsibility, you must insist that you were tricked by Fengying. He deliberately deceived you, and you also intended to fulfill the sect leader's orders. You hit it off, no one is wrong." "Yes." Yu Dong nodded. "Well, now that you have completed your mission, you still have to do as this old man said and pay your respects to Martial Uncle Yu Bing. If anything happens in the future, he will help you." Seeing that Yu Dong was very obedient, Yu Ping was relieved and smiled as he flew towards the Brahma Golden Palace. But after flying for a while, Yu Ping stretched out his hand and said, "Donger, give me your original stone mastery token." "Yes." Yu Dong reached out his hand and took out the stone tablet token that Yu Ping had just returned to him. Yu Ping took it and opened his mouth. A silver flying sword flew out and hit the jade talisman, shattering it into pieces. Then, with a twist of his hand, a silver-white light flashed and the jade talisman turned into powder. Yu Ping waved his hand and all the fragments floated into the air, landing on the sparse scarlet plants on the ground. With a few gusts of wind, they disappeared without a trace. "Let's go." Yu Ping finally felt relieved. He waved his hand and flew away. Yu Dong blinked his eyes and opened his mouth, but not a single word came out. He was still thinking about how he should answer if no one asked him about it, or how he should make this lie perfect. Just like what Yu Ping thought, no one asked Yu Dong, Even if there were dozens of Yu family disciples who met Yu Dong, they would only nod with a smile or leave without even looking at him. They knew that the only reply they would receive was a single word from Yu Dong. Seeing such a situation, while Yu Ping appeared calm on the surface, his anxious heart finally calmed down. Even a foundational cultivator, who had done something wrong, would feel uneasy in his heart. Go, Senior Uncle Yu Bing is in his quiet room. Go and pay your respects. After walking to the plaza, Yu Ping pointed at another door and instructed Yu Dong. Yes. Yu Dong did not say anything else, nodding his head and walking towards the door. Yu Ping hesitated for a moment before walking towards the room, where Xiaohua was imprisoned. Looking at the room from afar, which was no different from the other rooms, a trace of ruthlessness flashed past Yu Ping's eyes. He did not even dare to approach it, glancing at it a few times before leaving. The pitiful Xiaohua was still paying attention to the door, waiting for someone to check on him before using his concealment technique. Or perhaps he could use his concealment talisman to escape without anyone noticing. Who would have thought that even if the other party discovered him, they would not disturb him at all, directly making him into a blood sacrifice? Who was the one who thought he was smart enough to walk right into the trap? Yu Ping had only just turned into a passageway when a late-stage Foundation establishment old man hurriedly walked over. It was precisely that old man Yu Bing that Xiaohua had seen at Wu Jiazigi's place. "Io, senior brother Yu Bing." Yu Ping saw him from afar and hurriedly said, "Dong is back." The moment he entered the palace, he immediately went to pay his respects to you. Did you see him? It is rare for Dong to still remember this old man. Seeing that it was Yu Ping, Yu Bing nodded his head slightly. However, his footsteps did not stop as he said, "This old man saw him just now." However, this old man had an important matter to attend to and did not listen to him speak in detail. Seeing that his cultivation has made some progress, he did not waste the past few years of training outside. Yes, Yu Ping smiled apologetically. This is all due to senior brother's care. If this old man does not take care of you all, who else can I take care of? Yu Bing laughed. You all are not old Hua at this point. A sharp tiger's roar could be heard in the air, resounding throughout the entire Brahma Gold Palace. Enough, this old man will not talk to you anymore. Quickly return to the quiet room. The last time is about to begin. Let's see if you all have any opportunities. Yu Bing waved his hand, stopping Yu Ping from following him as he instructed. I have already told Dong to hurry back to the quiet room. This child is really lucky to have returned today. Yes, this little brother understands. Yu Ping's heart trembled as he hurriedly stopped in his tracks. Looking at Yu Bing's back, he turned back to look at Xiaohua's small room before turning to another place. In just a moment, there were still many disciples of the Yu family walking back and forth in the square, but now, there was no one to be seen. Above the square, above the silver sky, Yu Qingtian had already stood up with a trace of excitement on his face. Holding the silver tiger-shaped magic tool in his hand, he looked at the two silver balls of light in front of him with bright eyes. At this time, the silver balls of light were already hundreds of feet in size. Above the two balls of light, one crimson and one azure, were boiling like boiling water. From time to time, the crimson and azure splendor would splash out from the balls of light, and countless tiny flames and tiny ice shards would fall from the sky. Even when the crimson brilliance collided with the azure brilliance, there were even rumbling sounds of explosions. Previously, there was only a part of the crimson and azure light, but now, more than half of the balls of light were filled by the crimson and azure light. The previous silver splendor was now more like a shell or a binding, completely restricting the crimson and azure light under the silver balls of light. As for the two azure and red crystal threads that were previously connected between the two balls of light, they were now as thick as a strand of hair, firmly holding the two balls of light together. The azure and red colors would overflow from time to time in the crystal threads. However, although the two crystal threads were entangled together like before, at this time, they were not as simple as a thin thread, but were entangled together in an extremely complicated manner, as if they were connected into a string of sword talismans. The sword talismans flickered under the crimson and azure splendor, as if they were about to break free from the crystal threads. The entire space above the cloud curtain, which was several times larger than the square, was filled with the aura of extreme yang and extreme yin. The entire space became unstable. Naturally, Yu Qingtian could not get close to the two silver balls of light. He was pushed far away by the extreme yang and extreme yin, more than 500 feet away. Although Yu Qingtian was holding the silver tiger firmly in his hand, his eyes were still staring at the noisy azure light ball. This azure light had been growing from a sliver of the silver light to nearly half of it now. It had been more than 10 years, and he had watched the growth of the 6 directions Yin spirit bit by bit. At this critical moment, even with his cultivation of the beginner gold core stage, he could not help but feel his heart in his throat. Unexpectedly, the azure splendor had been boiling for more than 3 days, and the azure light had increased by more than 30%, but there was still no special movement on the ball of light. Yu Qingtian looked at the crimson ball of light next to him. Although the crimson color of the ball of light was slowly growing along with the crimson crystal threads on the 2 balls of light, it was not growing as fast as the azure light ball. Now it had only grown by more than 10%. Yu Qingtian seemed to be deep in thought. The silver tiger in his hand swayed slightly, and a few faintly discernible rays of silver light fell from the surrounding space. Coincidentally, they covered the azure ball of light. For a moment, the silver light on the ball of light shone brightly, binding the azure splendor. Then, as if they were complementing each other, the crimson splendor intensified its agitation and accelerated its growth. After another day, there was a clear sound like a thunderclap, and the 2 balls of light suddenly stagnated. All the crimson, azure, and silver light stopped abruptly, and even the splendor that had just splashed out strangely stopped in mid-air. Yu Qingtian frowned, and the silver tiger in his hand shook slightly again, as if it was about to move. Unfortunately, before he could activate his spiritual power, a buzzing sound like a tiger's roar was emitted from the 2 balls of light at the same time. The crimson and azure lights of the 2 balls of light moved strangely again. However, this time they were not boiling, but were rotating in the silver balls of light. As they rotated, countless sword talismans appeared on the balls of light. After each sword talisman appeared, a ray of sword light rushed into the air, and the sword talismans sank into the balls of light. Of course, these sword talismans did not appear randomly, but appeared on the 2 balls of light at the same time. However, one was crimson, and the other was azure. With the appearance of these sword talismans, the crimson and azure lights gradually separated from the silver balls of light, and gradually sank into the silver balls of light. Seeing that the 2 balls of light had regained the bright silver color of decades ago, Yu Qingtian had a bad feeling in his heart. Chapter 2599. However, at this moment, the bright silver ball of light suddenly emitted extremely bright red and azure colors. Yu Qingtian involuntarily closed his eyes. When he opened his eyes again, he saw that the 2 bright silver balls had completely turned into red and azure colors. Woo-woo, the azure ball of light did not give Yu Qingtian any time to hesitate. With a strange sword hum, the ball of light emitted rays of brilliance, and the brilliance condensed into the beautiful figure of Zhang Yuhe in mid-air. Sect Master Yu, thank you for your help, Zhang Yuhe said indifferently. Now that my 6 directions Yin spirit is ready, and the 6 directions Yang spirit of your foundation establishment stage boy is also ready, we can carry out the last blood sacrifice. As long as the blood and souls of the last living creatures are sent into the sword spirits, these 2 sword spirits will have the initial spiritual intelligence. Then, our cooperation will be successful. Then Zhang Yuhe, who was in the sword shadow, raised her head slightly, looked at the silver sky above her head, and said, "In addition, I can also help you attract the sword energy and sword intent of the sword catacomb, and help the disciples of the Yu family of fallen gold mountain turn stone into gold. Consider it a little sincerity from me." After saying that, the sword light flashed and scattered, like flying flowers scattering on the ground, fell into the ball of light, and disappeared. Yu Qingtian forced a smile on his face, but when he heard the last sentence, embarrassment appeared on his face, and even surprise appeared in his eyes. Yu Qingtian was stunned. The silver tiger in his hand moved, but it did not send out any signal. Guji. There seemed to be a light bell-like sound, and a smiling Zhang Yuha's beautiful face appeared on the azure ball of light. Sect Master Yu, why are you hesitating? If you feel that it is inappropriate, you can ask your little foundation establishment stage cultivator. I will cover my ears. Whoosh! Similarly, dozens of red sword lights flew out of the red ball of light, and a faintly discernible figure of Yu Tong appeared. Sect Master. Yu Tong's somewhat helpless voice sounded. There is no need to hesitate at this time. Now that things have come to this, we have no choice but to release the arrow from the bow. Sect Master, you should carry out the last blood sacrifice. Alright, be careful. A hint of bitterness appeared on Yu Qingtian's face. He looked at the azure brilliance and saw Zhang Yuha covering her ears with her hands. With a wave of his hand, the silver tiger emitted a bright silver light. Tens of thousands of silver rays shot out from the silver tiger's mouth and rushed straight to Yu Qingtian's feet. They passed through the silver clouds and landed on a large area below him. The strange thing was that the places where these light beams landed were exactly the huts where Xiao Hua and the others were. Moreover, every light beam landed on a hut. Wung wung. A deafening sound was emitted from these rays of light. Along with this sound, the rays of light began to vibrate. Along with this vibration, more than 10,000 small houses separated from the Silver Palace. Unexpectedly, each small house became an independent small silver lattice. This lattice was very strange. It had edges and corners, and actually looked like a hexahedron. Following these tens of thousands of light particles, after these silver lattices separated, they did not fly up into the air. Instead, they slowly sank, and the entire square became a huge hole. Below the hole was not a soil layer, but a large area of silver brilliance. These tens of thousands of lattices slowly moved in this silver brilliance, like stars in the sky. They gradually formed a mysterious magic array, and then stopped. When all the lattices stopped moving, with a whoosh, all the silver light particles returned to Yu Qingtian's silver tiger. Yu Qingtian rested for a moment, then shook his hand again. The silver tiger emitted light particles from all over, and several silver rays as thick as a fist rushed down, aiming at the surroundings of the huge hole. Whoosh whoosh whoosh, the silver rays landed on the doors around the hole, then turned into rainbows, becoming thumb-sized rainbows that hit the doors. The doors also began to shake violently. The rainbows swept past the rooms behind the doors, and the silver houses also slowly floated up. After a while, about 9 silver houses floated up from the huge hole, and the silver brilliance immediately covered these houses. However, the tens of thousands of lattices were at the bottom of the silver brilliance, and these 9 houses were above these lattices, surrounding them. After everything was done, Yu Qingtian sat down cross-legged, clapped his hands, and took out an elixir and put it into his mouth. Sect Master Yu, you should still improve your cultivation. Zhang Yuha jumped out, and a beautiful sword-like figure fluttered on the azure light ball. Why don't this sword lend you a hand in a while? In order to cooperate with you, this old man has racked my brains for decades. When did I have the time to cultivate in seclusion? Yu Qingtian snorted coldly, opened his eyes slightly, and said, instead of helping this old man, you ridiculed me. This old man is starting to doubt your sincerity in cooperating with me. Hee, isn't this sword just going to lend you a hand? Zhang Yuha giggled. Obviously, she was very happy because the sword spirit was about to be formed. Yu Qingtian was stunned, and immediately realized that he had misspoken, so he closed his eyes and ignored Zhang Yuha. Zhang Yuha's figure danced in the azure ball of light for a long while. Then she suddenly transformed into an azure flying sword. Kung, a crisp sword cry rang out. She directly rushed towards the silver-white sky above the space. Following the emergence of the azure flying sword, a slightly smaller scarlet flying sword also flew out from the scarlet light ball. Similarly, a clang-clang sound was heard. The 2 flying swords rushed into the space, one in front and one behind, one in green and one in red. The scarlet flying sword rushed into the brilliance of the azure flying sword like a swallow returning to its nest. The 2 swords intertwined with each other, and with a resounding clang sound, they quickly pierced toward the silver-white sky. An incomparably sharp and invincible sword essence quickly overflowed in the entire space. This little girl's cultivation, has improved a lot again. Yu Qingtian opened his eyes helplessly, as if he was already familiar with Zhang Yuha's move. As he muttered to himself, he did not forget to take a look at the scarlet light ball. He saw that the sword runes on the light ball were similar to the azure light ball, but it did not have Zhang Yuha's arrogant figure. Go! Yu Qingtian shook his silver tiger, and a faint silver light was emitted from it. The silver light swayed slightly and vibrated with a strange fluctuation. The silver light did not chase after the green and red sword light. Instead, it shone in all directions, and the fluctuation fell below Yu Qingtian's body. The ripples had already landed on the silver canopy beneath Yu Qingtian, and it immediately began to vibrate. The vibrations quickly filled the entire space, and very soon, they surpassed the flying sword and reached the canopy that the flying sword was about to stab. Almost without any sound, the sky suddenly split open like a pair of sharp scissors cutting through silk, revealing the clear night sky beyond the sky. At this moment, the stars were shining brightly in the night sky, and a crescent moon hung in the sky like a boat. The azure and red flying swords crossed the sky and rushed straight into the night sky. Not only did the dazzling sword light illuminate the entire night sky, but the clang of the sword also resounded throughout the 9 heavens. Woo! As soon as the azure and red flying swords appeared, all the broken swords within 100 miles responded. Countless mournful cries were heard from the sword tomb, as if they were crying and surrendering. A swordsman? Far away from the sword tomb, LV Ruochang and the other third-grade illusory swordsmen were fleeing toward the sword tomb in a panic. Suddenly, they saw a strong sword essence rushing out of the sword tomb and arousing their sword spirits. The sword origin in their bodies surged, and their flying swords also cried out, wanting to rush out of their bodies. They all turned pale with fright. Yes, how could they not turn pale with fright? According to their thinking, the hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators and dozens of golden core cultivators in the meeting hall had been led by the nose to the sword tomb. If they appeared out of nowhere and transformed into swords, how could those Dao sect cultivators fall into their trap? Wouldn't the appearance of the sword transformation master alert the enemy? Besides, the location of the sword transformation master was different from the direction of the sword formation that LV Ruochang had set up. Once LV Ruochang entered the sword tomb, would he go in the direction of the sword transformation master's sword essence? Or would he go in the direction of the sword formation? In an instant, LV Ruochang made a decision. She waved her hand and said, "Let's go. Let's fly to the place where the sword transformation master appeared. Otherwise, those Taoist sect practitioners will be able to tell that we haven't really lost. They will be able to discover our plan to lure the enemy." Yes, the surrounding swordsmen were also helpless. They passed the order to each other and hurriedly searched for a route, preparing to fly toward the Yu family in the falling gold mountain. But right at this moment, the sword transformation master's aura suddenly disappeared, as though it had never appeared. Sigh, LV Ruochang sighed. However, she knew that this was the real sword transformation master's sword essence. It was majestic and abnormally fresh. It was definitely not some broken sword essence from the sword tomb. Even if she couldn't lure all the Taoist sect practitioners into the sword formation that she had set up, she definitely couldn't blame this sword transformation master, who appeared out of nowhere. Since LV Ruochang had sensed this sword transformation master's sword essence, the Jindam practitioners in the conference hall naturally sensed it as well. Gao Wei from the Seven Skills sect was the first to stop. He hurriedly sent a message to Lu Xingwu of the Splendid sect, reminding them that a sword transformation master with strength comparable to a nascent soul practitioner had appeared. Soon, the hundreds of thousands of practitioners stopped as LV Ruochang had expected. They pondered whether they should continue the pursuit or not. All kinds of communication talismans flew around in the air. Not long after, the Jindam practitioners in the conference hall gathered together again. Gao Wei, who was the first to discover this, didn't wait for the others to speak and shouted. A sword transformation master actually appeared in the sword tomb. This can only mean one thing. This is the reinforcements of the Huan country's swordsmen. I suggest that we chase to this place and resolutely not to chase into the sword tomb. Chapter 2600. Hung Zhao did not answer. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and looked in the direction of the Brahma Golden Palace, and the direction in which the sword cultivators had fled. He seemed to be deep in thought. After everyone had discussed for a while, Hung Zhao asked, "What Cultivator Gao said makes sense. However, I would like to ask, if the sword cultivators had a hidden hand in the sword tomb, would the swordsman who transformed into a sword be exposed? Besides, can a swordsman who transformed into a sword participate in the battle now? Perhaps it is not a swordsman who transformed into a sword, but it must be a hidden hand of the sword cultivators." Gao Wei, of course, also realized this point and immediately cried out. However, according to what I know, the sword cultivators did not flee in the direction of the sword light. They fled in a different direction, De Sun said with a smile. It seems that they saw the sword light and changed their direction. Regardless of whether it is a hidden hand or not, the sword cultivators may have other hidden hands in the sword tomb other than our Taoist sect's array. I do not recommend advancing rashly, Lu Xinwu said. Actually, according to the sword cultivator's final change of direction, the sword light should not be a hidden hand, Hung Zhao said with a smile. It is very likely that it is a swordsman who transformed into a sword. These sword cultivators are grasping at the last straw and want to transform into a sword to save them. Yes, that's right. Other than Gao Wei and Lu Xinwu, 80% of the remaining cultivators agreed with Hung Zhao. After all, they had seen the sword cultivators suddenly change direction. Do we have to face the swordsman directly? Zhu Jun of the Cool Breeze Valley, who had just recovered from his serious injuries, said in a low voice. So what if we face the swordsman? Can they make a move? Li Jijia of the Changbai sect said proudly, I would like to see the swordsman kill both of us. Haha, even if he transformed into a sword, he will not attack. Those sword cultivators have really lost. They are panicking, De Sun said with a smile. Actually, there is one more thing, Hung Zhao continued. This sword tomb is truly huge. Although my Dao sect's 10-direction annihilation formation covers over 50 kilometers, it is still insignificant within this sword tomb. This is something that we did not consider when we were discussing setting up a large formation to ambush sword cultivators within the sword tomb. We are chasing after the sword cultivators, but how can we lure them into the large array? I was just discussing this matter with senior brother De Sun. The direction that the sword cultivator fled in is completely different from the location of the great array. We can either stop chasing him, or chase him in the direction of the great array. However, before the two of us could come to a conclusion, the sword light appeared. Although it wasn't in the direction of the formation, it wasn't far from it. Everyone, do you think that the heavens are helping my Dao sect? Heh, or is it fellow Daoist Xiong's generosity in the sword tomb? Yuan Zhongyu of the Kunlun sect laughed. Anyway, the sword cultivator is heading towards the 10-direction annihilation formation that my Dao sect has set up a long time ago. Do you think we should chase after him or not? Hung Li asked loudly. Many gold core stage cultivators had a little discussion. Under the situation where most of the cultivators agreed, they passed down the order of the conference hall, and hundreds of thousands of cultivators continued to chase into the sword tomb. LV Ruochang and the other swordsmen were even more delighted when they saw the cultivators chasing after them. However, in order not to arouse the suspicion of the cultivators, they still headed in the direction of the Brahma Gold Palace. When the time was right, they would turn in the direction of their own great array. The green and red sword light that had changed the entire situation of the battle between the Dao cultivators paused in mid-air for a moment before suddenly descending and landing on the two balls of light. However, things did not end with the fall of the two sword lights. The incomplete sword essence within 100 miles of the sword light flashed with all kinds of sword lights and flew toward the two balls of light. Even the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth in the sword tomb rushed over with the sword light with its unique tyranny, setting off countless hurricanes within 100 miles. The hurricane's target was the Brahma Gold Great Array. Yu Qingtian, who had already opened the sky canopy of the Brahma Gold Great Array, could no longer close his eyes and meditate at this time. He activated his magic power and cast a spell. The silver tiger turned into a tiger about a foot long and flew into the sky. It opened its mouth and thousands of silver threads rushed into the sky canopy, covering the entire area where the great array had been torn apart just now. Woo-woo! Countless sword lights surged and sword chi surged. The incomplete flying sword carried the incomplete sword essence, and rushed into the silver light canopy above the great array. The light canopy was pressed into a concave shape, but with the support of the silver tiger, it was still stable. At this time, the true face of the Brahma Gold Great Array was revealed. The array was an oval-shaped silver space that was filled with a silver brilliance. At the top of this space was the silver tiger, the magic weapon that controlled the Great Array. In the center of the Great Array were the two balls of light of the Great Yin-Yang Six Directions Sword Spirit. They were slightly lower than the other balls of light. They were 9 silver areas, which were the rooms where the disciples of the Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain cultivated. At the bottom of the Great Array, there was a very mysterious place. It was the grid where Xiaohua and the others were going to be blood sacrificed. These grids were operating strangely in the silver light. Yu Qingtian's figure flew in the air, parallel to the two balls of light. He pointed his finger, and with a quick sound, the concave light curtain flickered slightly, and a huge amount of sword energy and metal elemental spiritual energy of heaven and earth, mixed with some of the flying swords and sword intent, rushed into the formation. The sword chi and gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth did not stop at all, and directly rushed into the 9 silver areas and the blood sacrifice grid. On the contrary, the two balls of light did not leave a trace. This was because the flying swords and sword essence rushed directly into the two balls of light. However, the flying swords and sword essence did not cause any ripples when they fell into the balls of light. In the blink of an eye, even more fragments of sword essence flew out from the balls of light. As soon as these fragments of sword essence came out, the balls of light absorbed the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth, and rushed to the 9 areas surrounding the balls of light, and Yu Qingtian's body with fierce sword chi. There were also some fragments that gradually fell into the blood sacrifice grid. However, after passing through the two balls of light, the sword essence fragments were no longer as violent as before. There was only abundant sword chi produced by absorbing the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Swish, 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 in the 9 silver areas, colorful lights flashed, and the fragments of the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth, sword essence, and sword essence were absorbed at the same time. The silver light that covered the thousands of grids slowly produced a kind of fluctuation. All the grids gradually trembled, and from the thousands of grids, there were thousands of small suction forces. These suction forces were extremely powerful, and they also drew in the fragments of the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth, sword essence and sword essence. However, as soon as these suction forces appeared, another kind of mysterious fluctuation was immediately produced in this area. It slowly passed through the silver light, and rushed into the two balls of light in the center. This fluctuation went through the balls of light again, and the rhythm of the fluctuation had already changed slightly. Naturally, Xiaohua was also in one of the grids. He sat quietly and couldn't perceive the changes in the entire grid. From the original square sinking and moving in the silver light, he didn't feel anything at all. After comprehending the secret technique from the jade slip of Falling Gold Mountain, and the ordinary sword cultivator's sword slip, he took out the incomplete sword transformation sword technique that he obtained from the secret auction in Sky Patrol City. Finally, he dug out the memories of Qin Jian that little white dragon gave him. Now, Xiaohua's cultivation was already at the peak of the late stage of foundation establishment. Although he didn't know if he had reached the peak of foundation establishment, he could step into the gold core stage at any time. His strength was at least comparable to a cultivator at the late stage of gold core stage. How could he be interested in a simple sword cultivation technique? Besides, he already had the flying sword technique of sword plays the world. Now he also had the real sword cultivation technique of 9 stars illuminating the sun. He also had a higher level of attainment in sword cultivation. His vision was even higher. After looking at the secret technique for so long, he had some gains in his heart. He had already set his goal of comprehension on the primordial spirit sword controlling technique, and the sword heart. Planting the sword intent into the sword spirit, and letting one's soul combine with the sword spirit, Only then can one become one with the flying sword. The sword heart is the heart of the flying sword. This heart is the soul of the person who transformed into the sword, and the flying sword is the body of the sword. Isn't this the same as the cultivation goal of a weapon cultivator? Xiao Hua instantly thought of Ji Yi, who had integrated the seal of overturning the sea. It's no wonder that the Dao sect treats sword cultivators as abnormal. Dao sect cultivators nourish their true qi and use it to condense a core in the dantian. They also use the core to nourish their qi and communicate with the yin and yang of heaven and earth. They nurture a baby in the golden core. When the baby is born, they nourish it with the qi of heaven and earth and strengthen it. When the baby grows up, the baby and the physical body, Xiao Hua thought happily, as if he could feel the superiority of the Dao sect. However, when he thought of the realms after the nascent soul stage, although he still didn't have the true spirit severing technique, he suddenly woke up and cold sweat seeped out of his body. Damn it, that's not right. If that's the case, then in the end, the nascent soul, isn't it the same thing as the sword heart? He had already faintly sensed this idea when he was meditating after the secret auction. However, he didn't think too much about it. Now that he had obtained more secret techniques and comprehended more, he thought about it again and felt a lot of emotions. That is to say, no matter what sword cultivator, weapon cultivator, beast cultivator, or Dao sect cultivator, in the end, they will all return to the same place. Xiao Hua sighed. Then what about the Buddhist sect? It seems there is a difference? I can't see it now. What about Confucian cultivators? What about soul cultivators? Devil cultivators? There is no such thing as an infant in a devil cultivator. They only cultivate devil fire and devil blood. I'm afraid only Zhang Qingxiao herself knows what level she will reach in the end. It had to be said that this was the shortcoming of Xiao Hua's dabbling in too many things. When he had a little enlightenment in one direction, he would immediately have some ideas in other directions. Whether these ideas were right or wrong, and whether they could help his cultivation, he himself didn't know. Chapter 2601. Of course, on the other hand, if Xiao Hua could comprehend all of his cultivation techniques by analogy, it would be extremely beneficial to his cultivation. Let's not talk about anything else. Take flying swords as an example. Xiao Hua himself understood the art of swords playing the world, and he himself knew the art of transforming flying swords. After coming into contact with the sword arts of sword cultivators, his flying swords cultivation improved by leaps and bounds. It was simply not something that ordinary swordsmen could hope to catch up to. Just when Xiao Hua had some comprehension, he suddenly felt that there were some changes in the small house. It actually started to tremble slightly, and an indescribable fluctuation spread throughout the small house. Xiao Hua used his divine sense to investigate and immediately understood. Isn't this the fluctuation mentioned in the secret technique? Could it be this so-called Midas touch is real? In order to expand their influence and even establish a sect, this fallen gold mountains Yu family spent a lot of money? And, if that's really the case, then this young master has indeed wronged the Yu family, and even the fallen gold mountains Yu family. Xiao Hua was someone who knew when to correct his mistakes. He was rather lucky that when he entered the small house, he did not suddenly disappear or make a move to create some trouble for this Midas touch. If this young master is able to benefit from this, I'm afraid that I will really help them in the future. However, is there really a foundation establishment pill in this world that would appear out of nowhere? However, Xiao Hua immediately laughed in his heart. Since this place cannot confine this young master, it won't be difficult for this young master to escape from here. Let's just wait and see how it disintegrates. Thinking about this, Xiao Hua activated the secret technique in the jade slip. A suction force that was neither large nor small rushed out from his body, and was transmitted into the fluctuation. Through this fluctuation, a suction force was produced from the small box and rushed up to the space above. Shua, a dense metal attribute spiritual energy passed through the small house and filled Xiao Hua's surroundings. Xiao Hua secretly nodded his head and activated the secret technique. The metal attribute spiritual energy was indeed drawn into his body. However, when he reached this point, Xiaohua stopped and thought to himself. If it was someone else with this kind of breathing and drawing spiritual energy into their body, their cultivation would definitely be impressive. However, what benefits does this kind of thin stream of metal attribute spiritual energy have to me? This young master only needs to activate the celestial body bestowment technique, and the metal attribute spiritual energy in the house will probably all be sucked into my body. Forget it, Xiaohua said with a smile. Let's use this secret technique to see if there is any special shady business. Thinking this, Xiaohua once again stimulated his cultivation method. The heaven and earth spiritual energy entered his body and was gradually tempered by Xiaohua's cultivation method. Sure enough, a faint trace of true essence was slowly born. This true essence was not as tyrannical as Xiaohua had imagined. It was similar to the true essence refined from ordinary heaven and earth spiritual energy. Oh, this Midas is Midas long as the secret technique. The Midas heavenly spiritual energy, it would have been tyrannical nature spiritual energy. Most of the metal was the tyrannical nature was. There was tyrannical nature was tyrannical, and was not great to the sword cultivators to the sword and sword to cultivate to the cultivators to be. However, for the Yu family of Falling Gold Mountain to be able to establish such a large scale and do shady business of turning stone into gold, it was not out of Xiaohua's expectations that this secret technique would be able to turn the tyrannical nature of the metal attribute spiritual energy back into ordinary metal attribute spiritual energy. Who would have thought that the moment Xiaohua's smile appeared, it would freeze again? Along with the influx of the gold-attributed spiritual energy of heaven and earth, some fragmented sword intent mixed with the sword energy formed from the gold-attributed spiritual energy of heaven and earth also swarmed into the small room. Once Xiaohua's skin came in contact with the sharp sword energy and the rather familiar sword intent, an extremely cold feeling emerged from his skin and directly entered the bottom of his heart. This coldness was like a bolt of lightning flashing through his mind. No, that's not right. This secret technique is far more than this. The smile on Xiaohua's face was instantly shattered and was replaced with shock, or even surprise. However, he didn't have time to think too much about it. He hurriedly urged the secret technique to absorb the bits of shattered sword intent and sword chi into his body, and began to refine them with the secret technique. However, just as he was about to transform the sword chi into true essence with great difficulty, Xiaohua had another thought. He changed the last part of the secret technique that was used to transform true essence to the sword technique used by sword cultivators to condense sword origin. Indeed, it was extremely difficult to convert sword chi into true essence. However, not only was it easy to convert sword chi into true essence, the amount of sword chi was also many times more than true essence. Xiaohua stored the strand of sword chi into his body and unknowingly clenched one hand into a fist, and the other hand into a palm. His face revealed a look of ecstasy. Fuck. The Yu family of Falling Gold Mountain is definitely not an ordinary cultivation family. What a strange secret technique. How is it possible for an ordinary cultivation family to possess such a technique? Xiaohua almost cried out in shock. This sword intent is a swordsman's understanding of the flying sword. It is the soul of the flying sword in a swordsman's heart. When a swordsman refines his sword intent, he will also gradually condense his soul into the sword intent. In this sword tomb, there are countless sword intents, whether they are nurturing swords, shining swords, or illusory swords. All of these sword intents are damaged and deeply engraved with the soul of the deceased swordsman. These sword intents cannot be used by a swordsman normally, but this Falling Gold Mountain's Yu family is actually able to shatter these sword intents and erase the imprint of the soul, leaving behind only the pure sword intent. To a swordsman, the sword intent and sword spirit are more or less fused together. Furthermore, this sword intent has a sword spirit, and it is unavoidable that the spiritual energy of heaven and earth can be condensed into sword chi, and this sword chi through this secret technique can be converted into sword origin. Especially the sword chi with the fragmented sword intent. It is just like refining a pill. If a cultivator wants to take this pill, they can only absorb a small portion. But what about a swordsman? They should be able to absorb all of it. This young master has always been unable to form sword intent, because I do not have sword origin. Now there is a ready-made opportunity. Others want to convert it into true essence, but this young master does not need it and directly absorbs it, to form sword origin. This is really dogshit luck. Thinking about this, Xiaohua's mind became active again, and he could not help but deviate again. But why don't those sword cultivators of the Huan country have this kind of secret technique? Also, that little dear sword intent of Taoist bright sword. Forget it, what's the point of thinking so much? Xiaohua hurriedly suppressed his curiosity, and activated the secret technique, to begin drawing in the sword qi and fragmented sword intent. Of course, after a short moment, Xiaohua slapped his forehead again, and activated the immortal body bestowment technique. An extremely powerful suction force was born from his body. Whatever the metal attribute spiritual energy of heaven and earth, whatever fragmented sword intent, whatever sword qi, whatever they were all sucked into his body like a tautai opening its mouth. Then he activated the secret technique, and the speed at which sword origin was produced increased by a lot. When Xiaohua activated the immortal body bestowment technique, the suction force of the small grid naturally increased by a lot, and even more sword intent fragments and sword qi were snatched over. However, this suction force was still not enough compared to the overall suction force of the small grid. It did not cause any abnormalities at all, and it was impossible to be noticed by Yuqing Tian, or Zhang Yuha. The sword qi and sword intent in the sword catacomb seemed to be endless. Zhang Yuha's sword spirit had been withdrawn for a long time, but the sword qi and sword intent that were pouring in did not stop. However, the layer of silver grid that Yuqing Tian's silver tiger had scattered in the sky could not support it. Moreover, such a big movement in the sword catacomb could easily attract the attention of others. Yuqing Tian grabbed with his hand, and several silver brilliants flashed on his right hand. The silver tiger roared and rushed to the sky. The brilliance around its body shone brightly, and a shadow of a silver tiger appeared. It slowly flew to the grid and blocked the flying swords and other objects that were rushing in. When it was level with the grid, the shadow turned into a ray of brilliance and merged into the grid. Immediately, the flaw of the large formation was repaired. Haha, Zhang Yuha's smile flashed on the azure light ball again. Lord Yu, it's only been a few hours. The vital essence that you've absorbed is not enough to raise your cultivation level, right? Why did you turn off the large formation so early? Hehe, this is not the usual time. Yuqing Tian did not care about Zhang Yuha's ridicule. The battle between Taoist cultivators is here. Swordsmen and city guards of Sky Patrol City often pass by the edge of the sword catacomb. It's best not to make any noise. With that, Yuqing Tian stretched out his hand, and the silver tiger fell into his hand. Silver light flashed all over his body, and a large number of light beams were emitted from the silver tiger, hitting various parts of the sky. The silver light above the large formation flashed violently at first, and then it began to rotate. After the time it took to smoke a cigarette, it finally stopped. Zhang Yuha's face was solemn as she hovered above the azure light. She knew that the Buddhist golden array controlled by Silver Tiger was constantly changing. Even if a swordsman were to pass by, he would not be able to find any trace of the array. It was just as Xiaohua thought. How could a cultivation family with such a wonderful secret technique not have a wonderful concealment formation? However, the seriousness only flashed across Zhang Yuha's face for a moment, and was immediately replaced by a sneer. Zhang Yuha's beautiful figure also disappeared from the azure light ball. It seemed that Yuqing Tian had consumed a lot of his magic power to conceal the large formation again. After Yuqing Tian swallowed an elixir, he said gently, "Little friend Zhang, now that everything is ready, can we start the last blood sacrifice? I've been ready for a long time. You'd better ask your foundation establishment boy first." Zhang Yuha did not show her face, but only sent her voice out. Yuqing Tian looked at the crimson ball of light again. The ball of light was similar to the azure brilliance, and many sword talismans appeared on it. The sword talismans were stacked on top of each other, and no one knew how many layers and sword talismans there were. "Yutong, are you ready?" Yuqing Tian's figure floated in front of the red light ball. Sword light flashed on the light ball, and a faint figure appeared. Yu Tong seemed to be weak, but he seemed to be supporting himself. He said, "Granduncle, the boy can barely control the sword spirit, so he should be able to withstand a blood sacrifice. If this blood sacrifice succeeds, the boy's cultivation will definitely reach the peak of the late foundation establishment stage, and he will be able to control the sword spirit." Chapter 2602. Alright, since that's the case, let's not delay any further. Yu Qingtian nodded slightly. The Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain has been preparing for decades. Today we'll do it in one go. Yes, boy, I'll follow your arrangements. Yu Tong's figure slowly disappeared. It was far less elegant than Zhang Yuha's disappearance. Yu Qingtian watched as Yu Tong's figure disappeared, and a hint of hesitation appeared on his face. However, after a moment, he turned around again and took a few steps forward solemnly. With a wave of his hand, the silver tiger landed in front of him. The silver tiger was like a real white tiger. It shook its head and wagged its tail in midair. Even the scattered light on its body shook in the wind like a tiger's fur. Yu Qingtian took a deep breath and slapped his hand on his chest. He opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of blood essence. The blood essence fell in midair and was about to turn into droplets. Yu Qingtian grabbed with his hand, and the blood essence condensed into a ball and stopped. Yu Qingtian then chanted a strange incantation. The same obscure incantation slowly appeared on his hands. As a faint silver light fell on the blood essence gradually became smaller, and its color gradually deepened. After 10 minutes, the blood essence was almost invisible, but its color was almost pitch black. Go. Yu Qingtian raised his hands with difficulty as if he was holding up a mountain. The pitch black dot slowly rose from its original place. As Yu Qingtian moved his hand, it hit the silver tiger's forehead. With a soft bang, a black-red mark appeared on the silver tiger's forehead. It was long and flat, like a third eye. The silver tiger also instantly lost its vitality and stopped in midair in a daze. Yu Qingtian's face was a little pale, and there was even a drop of sweat on his temples. However, Yu Qingtian did not have time to wipe it off. With a wave of his hand, the silver tiger landed in front of him. Yu Qingtian reached out and his hand slowly went into the mark on the silver tiger's forehead. Strangely, the mark was only the size of a thumb, but Yu Qingtian's hand went in very easily. When Yu Qingtian took out his hand, a fist-sized blood-red crystal appeared in his hand. This crystal was emitting a blood-red brilliance. It was extremely bewitching. There were countless folds on it, and when the silver light shone on it, it reflected countless rays of brilliance. However, all of these silver rays of light had turned blood-red. Yu Qingtian only glanced at the blood-red crystal for a moment before he felt an extremely heart-piercing bewitchment coming from it. He had an impulse to rush into it. He didn't dare to look at it again, and hurriedly moved his eyes away. He loosened his grip and the blood-red crystal flew into the air. As soon as Yu Qingtian loosened his grip, a blood-red curtain of light automatically flew out from the crystal. In an instant, it sprinkled over the entire space. Not only did it force the silver brilliance to the edge of the magic circle, but it also fell on the lowest level of the magic circle, where the thousands of small squares were located. However, at this time, the blood-red brilliance only covered the entire area. Under the light screen, the small grid was suffused with a strange blood-red color. Young friend Zhang Yutong, this old man is going to start. Yu Qingtian turned his head slightly, looked at the two balls of light not far away, and reminded them. Yes, the boy is ready. Yutong's voice rang out. A moment later, Zhang Yuha's voice also rang out. Sect Master Yu, this is the last blood sacrifice, and also the most important one. You and I have worked together very happily for the past few decades. I do not wish for any mishaps to occur at the final juncture. This old man understands. Yu Qingtian replied faintly. Young friend Zhang, how would you know about the effort this old man has put in? This old man hopes that nothing will go wrong on your side. Haha. Zhang Yuha chuckled again. Yu Qingtian ignored her and stretched out his hand. An extremely strange spell was formed in his hand, and with a flip of his hand, he hit his chest. Puff. A mouthful of blood essence with a silver brilliance spurted out, and Yu Qingtian's face instantly turned abnormally pale. Go. Yu Qingtian bit his lips slightly and grabbed with his hand. The ball of blood essence turned into a bloody shadow that was very similar to a tiger's and rushed toward the blood-red crystal. Buzz. The moment the blood essence touched the blood-red crystal, it immediately seeped in. A blood-red brilliance that was 100 times more intense than before bloomed on the crystal. The brilliance didn't spread far, and only lingered a few inches to the left of the crystal. The countless facets of the crystal gave birth to countless brilliances, and it swayed in and out like a blood-red stamen. Yu Qingtian chanted a strange spell again, and a faint layer of blood-red mixed with black gas was produced from his glabella, slowly covering his entire face. After waiting for the time it took to drink a cup of tea, drops of silver light appeared on Yu Qingtian's hand. There was a layer of blood-red spots on the silver light. Yu Qingtian carefully touched the blood-red stamen with his hand, and it was extremely gentle. Pa! The silver light dripped onto the stamen. Buzz! The entire blood-red space vibrated, and endless fluctuations rippled from the stamen. The stamen also suddenly opened. Fwa! As the stamen bloomed, another blood-red crystal was revealed. The stamen was like a flying dandelion, turning into thousands of blood threads that fell on the thousands of small squares. It was through the red light that the thousands of small squares were stuck one by one. Xiao Hua, who was in the small squares, naturally didn't know that the blood sacrifice had begun. He was proudly activating the immortal body bestowment technique, and the secret technique of the Yu family to refine the sword energy. However, the moment Yu Qingtian closed the Buddhist gold formation, the sword essence and sword qi that were pouring in stopped. Xiao Hua was quite stunned. However, the jade slip also stated clearly that there were other fluctuations behind it, which meant that there were still other secret techniques cooperating with it. However, after this secret technique was condensed into true origin energy, Xiao Hua only took a rough look at it before abandoning it. After all, he could use the sword technique of a sword cultivator, so who would use this useless thing? Now that the sword qi had stopped, it didn't take long for the fluctuations mentioned in the jade slip to appear again. Xiao Hua thought for a moment, then followed the instructions of the secret technique, and activated his inexplicable cultivation method. He wanted to see if there were any other surprises waiting for him. Sure enough, the Yu family of the fallen gold mountain gave Xiao Hua a great surprise. Just as Xiao Hua activated this cultivation method, a burst of qi and blood surged up. The true origin that he had refined earlier suddenly changed and rapidly rushed into his blood vessels. What is this? Xiao Hua was puzzled. Could it be that he wants to intensify the true bloodline? Feeling the blood vessels in his body begin to boil, and it was indeed somewhat similar to the awakening of Cui Hongshan's true bloodline. Xiao Hua didn't think much about it, and only smiled bitterly to himself. This young master doesn't have a true bloodline. However, at this moment, high in the sky where the blood sacrifice was taking place, Yu Qingtian opened his hand and covered the blood-red crystal. He opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of silver blood essence. The blood-red and black mist covering Yu Qingtian's face also fell into the crystal along with the blood essence. Up! Yu Qingtian seemed to have grabbed a heavy object, and with just a slight lift on the blood-red crystal, the crystal immediately began to emit blood-red smoke. Seeing the smoke rising, Yu Qingtian was relieved. He sat down next to the crystal, took out a medicinal pill, and sent it into the air. Then he closed his eyes slightly. Obviously, even a gold core cultivator like him couldn't bear the consumption of energy in that short moment. The blood-red crystal, along with the appearance of the smoke, began to tremble. The smoke also turned into thousands of thin strands and rushed into the thousands of blood sacrifice grids along with the blood-red light. Xiao Hua, who was in the grids, suddenly felt a suction force pass through the hut and cover him. Under this suction force, the boiling blood vessels were about to rush out of his body. This is bad. At this point, even if Xiao Hua didn't want to judge a gentleman with the yardstick of a villain, he couldn't help but be vigilant. He hurriedly stopped the secret technique, and wanted to use his cultivation method to stop the qi and blood that was gushing out. As the golden light around Xiao Hua's body flashed, the light protecting his body resisted the suction force. and the qi and blood that were about to seep out of his body also gradually fell back. This won't do. Who knows what kind of shady business this Yu family is up to? I'd better get out of here quickly. Xiao Hua made a prompt decision. He took out the spiritual talisman again and urged his magical power to hit the wall like before. However, contrary to Xiao Hua's expectations, when the spiritual talisman landed on the wall emitted a blood-red light, and the jade talisman was bounced back. The spiritual talisman seemed to be unable to penetrate the wall. This is bad. Xiao Hua's heart trembled, and he thought to himself, this is bad. Then he took out another jade talisman, but it still couldn't penetrate the wall. Damn it, this young master has been hunting wild geese all my life, but now, my eyes have been pecked by a wild goose. Xiao Hua smiled bitterly. This young master was only thinking about how to find out the dirty tricks of the Yu family, but I didn't expect to fall into the Yu family's trap. This hut is so strange. What kind of good thing can happen? This young master got a small advantage, but actually suffered such a big loss. This wall is turning blood red at this time. There must be some unforeseen event. Right at this moment, the suction force that was blocked by Xiao Hua's protective golden light suddenly increased, and the blood-red light emitted from the wall once again, gradually filling up the entire hut. Without any hesitation, Xiao Hua threw the jade talisman in his hand into the air. In a few breaths of time, the rabbit formation was laid out, and the suction force was negated by a little. However, Xiao Hua could already sense that the rabbit formation was not able to completely block the suction force, and the strange suction force was still sucking in the blood of Xiao Hua's body through the formation. I'm afraid that they have other plans. Xiao Hua hurriedly thought of another method, but in the blink of an eye, the suction force increased once again, as though it was stronger than before. At this moment, the suction force was so strong that it exceeded Xiao Hua's expectations, and he was a little flustered. The techniques of the Dao sect were all used to stabilize one's inner yuan and defend one's magical power. Very few of them were effective against attacking one's blood meridians. Apart from breaking the hut and escaping from this blood sacrifice formation, Xiao Hua did not have any other good methods. Chapter 2603. In a moment of desperation, Xiao Hua came to a realization. He was definitely not the only cultivator who had fallen into the trap of the Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain. This small hut was definitely not the focus of the Yu family's attack. In other words, even if he left the small hut, the outside of the small hut was where the suction force was. If he couldn't find a way to deal with the suction force and escape from the area of the blood sacrifice, he would still end up in the same situation as he was in the small hut. The suction force grew stronger and stronger. Xiao Hua could almost feel his qi and blood seeping out of his blood vessels and slowly flying out of his physical body. He also felt as though he was floating in the air. However, this was just a feeling. It was as though his blood vessels were bound by something and couldn't completely seep out. Or perhaps, the suction force was still too weak? However, Xiao Hua didn't have time to think too much about it. The suction force increased once again. Even the blood threads that had just entered the small house suddenly descended from the sky and covered his head. Within the blood threads, there was actually something similar to a soul thread that directly penetrated his scalp and approached the location of his soul in the mysterious dark cloud. Soul? Blood sacrifice? If it was just his qi and blood surging out, Xiao Hua might not have thought of blood sacrifice. However, how could Xiao Hua not think of something similar to a soul thread directly facing his soul? Damn the Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain. They actually dare to carry out a blood sacrifice here. They really deserve to die. Damn. Damn. A trace of fierceness flashed in Xiao Hua's eyes. He actually shouted damn 4 times in a row. It was obvious that he hated this blood sacrifice to the extreme. Since he knew that it was a blood sacrifice, Xiao Hua slapped his forehead and the soul thread stretched out like a tentacle. The soul thread's fluctuation was already so strong that it easily swept away the blood threads that were similar to soul threads. Xiao Hua even released his soul thread again and surrounded him. Waves of strong fluctuations were emitted and blocked the strong suction force. Yu Qingtian spat out a mouthful of blood essence on the blood-colored crystal. Countless wisps of smoke were produced and turned into thousands of thin wisps that rushed into the thousands of blood sacrifice grids along with the blood light. In the blink of an eye, thousands of drops of blood essence were sucked out from the thousands of small cells. Hysterical howls could be heard from the drops of blood essence. Fresh souls were struggling and roaring, trying to break free from the drops of blood essence and escape from the bloody light. Unfortunately, the suction force of the blood-red light was so great that even Xiaohua was almost unable to resist it. Most of these cultivators were aura-refining cultivators, so they simply didn't have any means to resist it. They followed the blood-red light and rushed into the vicinity of the blood-red crystal. Shua. At this moment, sword runes began to circulate above the azure ball of light. Countless flying swords rushed out of the ball of light and surrounded the azure ball of light. Go! Zhang Yuha's crisp and cold command was heard, and all the sword lights immediately pierced towards the blood-red crystal. Little brat Yutong, if you're not coming to help this sword, what are you waiting for? Following Zhang Yuha's command, hundreds of sword lights also flew out from the scarlet ball of light and pierced towards the blood-red crystal. When the red and azure sword lights pierced about a foot away from the crystal, the blood-red brilliance on the crystal flourished, and the sound of buzzing also became louder. A ball of blood-red light covered the crystal, blocking the sword lights 1 foot away. Close, Zhang Yuha gave an order, and the azure and red sword lights rapidly circulated outside the blood-red light shield, covering it. Of course, the blood-red brilliance could also penetrate through the sword lights. The azure and scarlet sword lights cooperated very well. Obviously, this was definitely not the first blood sacrifice. Collect. At this moment, the thousands or even tens of thousands of living souls had already flown close to the crystal with their essence and blood. Following Zhang Yuha's soft command, the azure and crimson sword radiance separated into wisps of sword radiance and pierced into these living souls. The living souls let out extremely unpleasant screams and were absorbed by the 2 balls of light along with the sword radiance. Not long after, the 2 balls of light were covered by a layer of blood red. This layer of blood red gradually merged with the balls of light, and the sword talisman that was almost solidified on top of the light also turned into a bright red color. Scandium. Scandium. 2 consecutive sword cries sounded, and the azure Zhang Yuha wearing a blood-red sword outfit flew out from the azure ball of light. The incomparably sharp feeling came from her body, as if she was originally a flying sword. This Zhang Yuha's expression was somewhat sluggish, and her eyes were almost unblinking. However, those eyes were filled with greed as they looked at the thousands of souls that flew out along with the blood threads not far away. Shua. Like a flash of sword light, Zhang Yuha's figure disappeared from the ball of light, and the next time she appeared, she was right in front of the blood-red crystal. Zhang Yuha opened her mouth, and hundreds of sword lights that were thinner than a strand of hair shot out from her mouth, and each of them pierced a soul. The souls struggled and howled as they were swallowed into Zhang Yuha's stomach. At the same time, a crimson Yutong wearing a Taoist robe also flew out from the ball of light. However, this Yutong was much shorter, and even its appearance was somewhat thin. Of course, this Yutong's expression was also sluggish. At the same time Zhang Yuha swallowed the souls, the Yutong also flew to the other side of the crystal, and with the same appearance, it spat out sword lights and swallowed the souls. Ha ha ha. After a while, Zhang Yuha's figure became even more voluptuous, and the Yutong's figure also became bigger and even taller. A loud laugh came from the azure ball of light, and another Zhang Yuha appeared from the ball of light. This Zhang Yuha was different from the previous Zhang Yuha. Sword talismans flashed around her body, and her face was filled with joy. That laughter came from her mouth, and it resounded through the entire blood-red space. Rise. Zhang Yuha gracefully stood on the ball of light like a dragonfly. She casually pointed, and a sword light pierced the sky, piercing through the light curtain that had been sealed long ago. With a loud bang, that sword light actually easily penetrated through. Little friend Zhang Yu, what are you doing? Yu Qingtian originally had his eyes closed, and when he saw Zhang Yuha's actions, he couldn't help but cry out in alarm, and immediately flew up from the ground. Of course, I'm condensing the sword heart. Zhang Yuha stopped laughing and said coldly. Through the gap in the great array that Zhang Yuha had created, the torrential rain poured down, and the whistling hurricane also rushed into it. Buzz buzz, however, this overwhelming torrential rain was still unable to stop the soaring sword will. The broken swords and sword wills within 100 miles were stimulated by this sword will, and they broke through the torrential rain and flew toward the Buddhist gold great array. Little friend Zhang, condensing the sword heart, doesn't seem to be within the scope of our cooperation. Yu Qingtian's expression was solemn, and he squinted his eyes slightly as he looked at Zhang Yuha. Haha. How is it not within the scope of our cooperation? Zhang Yuha's cold face squeezed out a smile. The purpose of refining the great yin-yang six-direction sword spirit is to form the sword heart. Only with the sword heart can one step into the sword transformation realm. Okay. Yu Qingtian didn't seem to want to argue with Zhang Yuha. He pointed his finger at the crimson ball of light and said, "Since you want to condense the sword heart, what about my Yu Tong? Why doesn't he come out and condense the sword heart?" His cultivation has only just stepped into the illusory sword realm, right? He's still a bit far from condensing the sword heart. Zhang Yuha said disdainfully. Then, how's the refining of his six directions yang spirit? Yu Qingtian asked again. Take a look for yourself. Zhang Yuha pointed at the yutong beside the crimson crystal and said, although it's still weak, it's already on the verge of completion. This sword can be considered to have completed the earliest agreement with you. Oh, Yu Qingtian looked at the yutong, who was a little sluggish at first, but after devouring the souls and blood essence, his eyes became more and more lively, and he nodded slightly. If that's the case, Yu Qingtian said word by word. The great yin-yang six-direction sword spirit has been successfully refined, and our agreement can be considered to have been completed. Condensing the sword heart is not within the scope of our agreement, so I'm afraid I can't agree to it. Ha ha ha, Zhang Yuha laughed and said. Sect Master Yu, isn't it bad for both of us to have a falling out at this time? The sword spirit of your yutong has not been completely refined yet. Yu Qingtian still shook his head. Young friend Zhang, don't think that this old man doesn't know. If you transform into a sword, how can this old man and the others restrain you? If you go back on your words, this old man and the others will. Unfortunately, before Yu Qingtian could finish speaking, Zhang Yuha laughed nastily and said, if you want to stop this sword now, is it too late? As she spoke, the crimson color around Zhang Yuha, who was in front of the crimson crystal, became thicker. She pointed at the crimson crystal that was covered by the sword light. The crimson light emitted by the crystal shook violently, and an unparalleled powerful suction force was born from the crimson light. The remaining cultivators in the small square who were bitterly resisting the blood sacrifice could not resist it, and all their souls and blood essence came out of their bodies. This all, naturally, did not include Xiaohua. However, Xiaohua's situation was not optimistic. He had just released his soul strands when he silently recited the secret technique of refining the yin-yang gourd during the blood sacrifice in the yin-yang Two Springs Mountain that day. He urged the soul strands to resist the powerful power of the blood sacrifice. When the two forces were balanced, he hurriedly waved his hand and took out the wishful staff. After raising it, he was about to smash it toward the small house. But at this time, Zhang Yuha and Yu Qingtian fell out and accelerated the speed of the blood sacrifice. This blood sacrifice battle was mysterious, so how could Xiaohua resist it with his soul cultivation power? Suddenly, he felt that the suction force was pulling his soul strands and his blood essence, and even the dark clouds of his soul were about to come out. Xiaohua's soul was scattered, so how could he still care about destroying the small house? In a hurry, he had an idea. He clapped his hand and took out the yin-yang sword gourd. He swung his hand and put it on top of his head. Xiaohua had held the yin-yang sword gourd for a long time, but he did not know how to use it. At this time, when he saw the same blood sacrifice as refining them, he had to take it out and try it. Chapter 2604. Sure enough, Xiaohua's soul strands wrapped around the scarlet red and azure sword gourds. Activating a secret technique, the soul strands trembled, and the two sword gourds released a scarlet red and azure brilliance respectively. The two sword gourds also produced a huge suction force, just like the suction force from the hut, and resisted the powerful force produced by Zhang Yuhe through the blood sacrifice array. Phew, feeling the qi and blood in his body gradually calm down, Xiaohua finally heaved a sigh of relief. He quietly clenched his fists, which had long been covered in cold sweat. At this moment, there was a huge change outside the blood sacrifice array. As Zhang Yuhe forcefully activated the blood sacrifice array, the remaining thousands of souls were extracted. Half of them entered the body of the Six Directions Yin spirit, and the other half was unexpectedly given to the Six Directions Yang spirit. Yu Qingtian, who was about to activate the Silver Tiger, hesitated at this moment. Although Zhang Yuhe had violated their agreement by forcefully condensing the sword heart after cultivating the Great Yin-Yang Six Directions Sword Spirit, Zhang Yuhe did not forget their agreement, and still helped Yu Tong refine the Six Directions Yang spirit. This made it difficult for Yu Qingtian to decide whether to fall out with Zhang Yuhe or not. While Yu Qingtian was hesitating, the flying swords, which were much more powerful than before, rushed into the Brahma Gold Array with sword intent and sword qi. Rise! There was a smile on Zhang Yuhe's face, but there was also a serious look on her face. She pointed with her finger, and the ball of light, which was covered with sword talismans and flashed with a layer of blood-red light, suddenly flew above Zhang Yuhe's head. The flying sword, sword intent, and sword qi all rushed into the ball of light. Buzz buzz buzz, the ball of light began to tremble violently. As the flying swords, sword intent, and sword qi rushed in, the azure ball of light began to boil again. The sword talismans on the surface of the ball of light spun crazily, like an alchemy furnace. Yu Qingtian watched from afar and bit his lip. From time to time he would look at the Six Directions Yang spirit that was devouring the souls. There was also the Six Directions Yin spirit that was still in perfect condition. The Six Directions Yang spirit in Yu Tong's image did not seem to be complete, so the devouring process was slightly slower. It took a full hour. After the Six Directions Yin spirit in Zhang Yuhe's image finished devouring the souls, there was a hint of a smile in its eyes. It looked thoughtfully at Yu Tong devouring the remaining souls, and then did not stop him. This also prevented Yu Qingtian from making a move. At this time, there were already a lot of flying swords, sword intent, and sword qi that had rushed into the azure light ball. Not only did the light ball not expand, it became even smaller. It was only 70% the size of the crimson light ball beside it. Moreover, from the bottom of the light ball, there was another azure crystal thread that was as thin as a hair. It was connected to the crimson light ball beside the light ball, and it slowly hung down on Zhang Yuhe's forehead. As soon as the azure threads came into contact with Zhang Yuhe's skin, they immediately disappeared, and even longer threads emerged from the ball of light. With a loud bang, the moment the crystal thread entered Zhang Yuhe's glabella, the azure light emitted a brilliant sword light. The sword talisman flowed wildly within the sword light, and a huge lotus flower was born from the sword light. Oh no! Seeing an unconcealable sharp aura emanating from the lotus flower, Yu Qingtian immediately came to his senses and shouted, "Zhang Yuhe, this lotus flower is your sword intent?" Ha ha ha! Zhang Yuhe laughed, and the azure sword light that had soared into the sky suddenly retracted and fell on the lotus flower. The wind and rain that filled the sky also slowly disappeared, and the flying swords and other things that had passed through the Brahma Gold Array also gradually decreased. However, all the sword intent and sword qi that had flown in were absorbed by Zhang Yuhe's lotus flower sword intent. This sword is called Yuhe, so naturally, I want to use the lotus flower as my sword intent, Zhang Yuhe said proudly. The lotus flower grows out of the mud without being stained. This is my lifelong pursuit. Good. Yu Qingtian raised his hand and looked at the Six Directions Yang spirit in the image of Yu Tong devouring the last dozen living souls. He shouted, "When my boy's Six Directions Yang spirit is cultivated, our agreement will be fulfilled. You can go wherever you want to condense your sword heart, and I will not interfere. Even if you want to condense your sword heart here, you can. However, you have to wait until I remove the Brahma Gold Palace. Otherwise, I will definitely not allow you to condense your sword heart here." As he spoke, the silver tiger flashed with a silver brilliance. The silver tiger roared angrily and transformed into a huge tiger with slender eyes that landed in mid-air. "Io, this sword is so scared. Zhang Yuha patted her towering chest and looked very scared. However, the playful smile in her eyes was not the fear that Yu Qingtian had hoped for. This sword has already started condensing my sword heart. Zhang Yuha's face turned cold. Do you think you can still stop this sword? What? Yu Qingtian was shocked. His gaze fell on the crystal thread on Zhang Yuha's forehead, and he suddenly realized something. Your sword spirit is not this 6 directions in spirit? Ha ha ha. When did this sword say that I want to use this 6 directions in spirit as my sword spirit? Zhang Yuha laughed, as if she was a little girl boy who had stolen candy from someone else, and only revealed the truth after she had eaten the candy. This sword already had its own sword spirit when it was conceived. Why would I still need this 6 directions in spirit as my sword spirit? You are now a sword spirit? Yu Qingtian's face turned pale as he said in disbelief. Yes and no, no and no, Zhang Yuha said with a smile. How can a Dao sect cultivator like you know the secret arts of sword cultivation? Then, she glanced at the 6 directions in spirit that had just swallowed the last living soul and smiled. Wait until this sword refines the real great yin yang 6 directions sword spirit, then you will know what it is. Roar! Yu Qingtian roared angrily. Zhang Yuha, how dare you violate the agreement between us? You have made a blood oath. Blood oath? Zhang Yuha stretched out her hand and said in confusion. The warriors of my divine sword region only recognize sword oaths. They have never heard of blood oaths. Yu Qingtian was so angry that his face turned green. However, since it's a blood oath, this sword is also afraid. Zhang Yuha said with a smile. But this sword made a blood oath with you, so that I can successfully refine the great yin-yang 6 directions sword spirit. At this time, the 6 directions yin spirit and the 6 directions yang spirit have not been completely refined. Why do you say that this sword has violated the agreement? At this point, how could Yu Qingtian not know that he had fallen into Zhang Yuha's trap? Zhang Yuha's real purpose was only to step into the sword transformation realm. Of course, this purpose was also the agreement between Yu Qingtian and Zhang Yuha. However, he never expected that Zhang Yuha would not rely on the great yin-yang 6 directions sword spirit to transform into a sword. Instead, she relied on the power of the living souls from the blood sacrifice, and accompanied the 6 directions yin spirit to secretly cultivate her own sword spirit. In particular, during each blood sacrifice, Zhang Yuha would attract the remaining flying swords, sword intent, and sword chi from the sword catacomb. At that time, Yu Qingtian was still complacent, and thought that Zhang Yuha had really kept her promise. In order to show her sincerity, she even helped the disciples of the falling gold mountain to improve their cultivation. Who would have thought that Zhang Yuha would absorb the flying swords, sword intent, and sword chi from the ball of light to temper her own sword intent? At the last blood sacrifice, she even used the sword intent from the sword transformation realm to attract enough sword chi and other things, providing the opportunity for the sword intent and sword spirit to fuse. The crystal thread under the sword intent was probably something that had been tempered to the extreme by the sword intent. It was probably the link between the sword intent and the sword spirit. Of course, this was not the most important thing. Yu Qingtian could tell that the great yin-yang 6 directions sword spirit was an extremely powerful sword cultivator technique. He had chosen Yu Tong to refine the 6 directions sword spirit with Zhang Yuha. Zhang Yuha had transformed into a sword, but Yu Tong was still in the ball of light, and had not come out. No one knew the specific situation, so he had probably fallen into Zhang Yuha's control long ago. Furthermore, refining the 6 directions sword spirit had cost nearly 100,000 lives, so Yu Tong's living soul might not be able to escape. Perhaps this was one of the conditions for refining the 6 directions yang spirit. Furthermore, after the 2 sword spirits of 6 harmonies devoured the living souls and blood essences, they spat out crimson and azure sword rays from their mouths and noses. They struck the crimson light around the crimson crystal, and the crimson light gradually shrank back under the sword rays. It was barely holding on. Zhang Yuha must have been plotting against the core of the blood sacrifice formation. Therefore, how could Yu Qingtian delay any longer with Zhang Yuha? He roared angrily, "Go to hell!" Following his roar, Yu Qingtian cast the spell that he had already made. As the brilliance flashed, Zhang Yuha's body suddenly bloomed with resplendent sword light. The silver chain that had flashed out of Zhang Yuha's body earlier did not appear as Yu Qingtian had expected. Instead, several silver streams of light appeared from time to time above the azure lotus. Ha ha ha! Zhang Yuha laughed loudly. Your Dao Sex imprisonment technique only imprisons the physical body, not the vital essence. How can it imprison the sword spirit of this sword? This sword has already transformed into a sword, so your so-called imprisonment chain is just a joke. Humph, Yu Qingtian sneered when he saw that Zhang Yuha had already seen through his trick. He pointed his finger at the silver tiger that was flying in the air. A silver light flashed in the silver tiger's eyes, and an obscure fluctuation was emitted from the silver light toward Zhang Yuha. Oz! When the fluctuation reached her in an instant, Zhang Yuha let out a heart-wrenching cry. Flashing silver chains appeared around Zhang Yuha's body. The chains turned inch by inch and tightened inch by inch, directly strangling Zhang Yuha's flesh and bones. Even though she had already transformed into a sword, she could not help but cry out, "Little friend Zhang." Yu Qingtian seemed to still not want to push things to a dead end. He said in a low voice, "My Dao Sex still has many tricks up its sleeve. This is just a child's play. Although you are a sword cultivator, a blood oath is still useful. When you made the blood oath, it was not desirable. Now that you have transformed into a sword, the blood oath is still effective. Why don't you and I each take a step back? You let my boy go and destroy all the hidden hands, and I will also remove the bone-corroding silver chain. What do you think?" Ha ha ha, Zhang Yuha endured the unspeakable pain and laughed. "How did I make the blood oath that day? Don't forget that the blood oath I made was that I can't transform into a sword in this life, and can only be a sword spirit. However, look, I have already transformed into a sword. Is your bullshit blood oath useful?" Chapter 2605. Little friend Zhang, are you serious about going against me to the end? Yu Qingtian sneered. What a joke. This sword has already transformed into a sword. What can a little gold core cultivator like you do to this sword? Zhang Yuha's body glowed with a boundless azure sword light, which pierced straight towards the countless thin silver light strands around her. Quick! Yu Qingtian did not dare to be negligent. He made a hand seal and hit the silver tiger again. The fluctuations on the silver tiger changed again, and the silver chains that bound Zhang Yuha spun faster. There were even sawtooth-like notches on the chains. Another heart-wrenching scream came from Zhang Yuha's mouth. Her face was extremely ferocious. Wang! Zhang Yuha couldn't bear it any longer. Her entire body glowed brightly, and a flying sword of the same size as her gradually appeared from within her body. Her figure slowly hid within the flying sword. However, as the flying sword transformed, the lotus sword intent, which had shrunk to the size of 3 feet, stopped shrinking, and the azure crystal threads also gradually faded. As soon as the flying sword transformed, an overwhelming sword force was emitted from the flying sword. It was like the pressure of a nascent soul cultivator, and it enveloped Yu Qingtian. However, the sword force was trembling and was not very stable. Obviously, Zhang Yuha had not completely transformed into a sword. Yu Qingtian did not dare to be negligent. He patted his forehead and released the pressure of a gold core cultivator at the same time, barely resisting the immature sword force. However, at this moment, there was a soft swoosh, and a sword light flashed. Yu Qingtian was almost caught off guard. The azure sword light had already struck the body of the silver tiger that was emitting fluctuations, transforming into a sword. It's really amazing. Yu Qingtian's eyes narrowed slightly when he felt the almost torrential sword qi above the sword light, and the rolling of the surrounding golden spiritual qi. It's really different from an illusory sword. Even so, there was no surprise on Yu Qingtian's face. Sure enough, when the terrifying sword light struck, the silver tiger was like an illusion and did not receive any damage at all. Instead, the silver tiger raised its head and roared angrily. The silver chain on the flying sword once again produced blood-colored threads of light. The threads of light wrapped around the flying sword, and actually corroded the sword beam of the flying sword. Zhang Yuha, You want to destroy the silver tiger within the Brahma gold great array? Dream on. Yu Qingtian sneered. Without any hesitation, he urged the silver tiger again. The blood-colored light turned into bloody flowers that frantically burned the flying sword that Zhang Yuha had transformed into. Roar! A roar seemed to come from her throat. The sword was gradually collapsing under the entanglement of the silver light and the burning of the blood. Zhang Yuha's figure became invisible in the sword light. At this moment, Zhang Yuha was no longer as arrogant as before. In fact, she looked extremely miserable. The silver light was like a sawtooth chain that was deeply embedded into her body. Countless tiny wounds were vaguely visible on her sword-like skin. Moreover, the burning of the blood directly penetrated into her body, as if her entire skin was reflecting a blood-red color. The blood-red color and the sword light intersected from time to time, and it looked really bloody. Zhang Yuha's eyes were wide open, and she opened her small mouth. Not only was her beautiful face deformed, but the silver chain also covered her entire body. Even her hands and arms were struggling with all their might, but they were also bound by the silver chain. She was far from being able to use her magical sword transforming ability. I'll fight you to the death. Zhang Yuha was so helpless that she screamed hysterically. She opened her mouth and spat out a small sword. In an instant, it turned into a rainbow and rapidly pierced between Yu Qingtian's eyebrows. Humph. Wishful thinking. Yu Qingtian sneered when he saw Zhang Yuha's final struggle and spat out her small sword. He stretched out his hand and threw out the magical weapon that he had prepared long ago. It was a silver shield that was the size of a palm. After flying out, it immediately turned into a shiny piece and blocked in front of Yu Qingtian. Puff, 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 a series of sounds came from the shield. The small sword was so sharp that it instantly pierced through more than 10 layers of the shield. However, the shiny shield seemed to be endless. No matter how many layers the small sword pierced, it would create a new one. Seeing that the shield had blocked the small sword, Yu Qingtian's lips curled into a smile. However, just as this smile appeared, he suddenly felt a chill in his heart. A golden core cultivator's instinct sensed that an unparalleled danger was coming from under his feet. Almost without thinking, he moved his body and was about to dodge elsewhere. Unfortunately, he was still too late. Perhaps the two green and red sword lights that flew from the blood-red crystal were too fast. Just as his body flashed, the two sword lights flew over and twisted around his left leg. His entire left leg was twisted into a bloody pulp, and this bloody pulp seeped into the sword lights and disappeared. It was only at this moment that Yu Qingtian realized that he seemed to have completely ignored the Six Directions sword spirit. He even looked at the Yu Tong, who raised his head and looked at him in disbelief. There was no pity in this Six Directions young spirit's eyes, only coldness. Yu Qingtian's physical body was injured, and he didn't dare to delay. He hurriedly clapped his hands and swallowed a spirit pill. Then, he cast a few spells on the wound on his left leg to stop the blood from gushing out. However, before he could stand firmly in midair, he felt a huge gust of wind in the space. Buzz, at the same time, Zhang Yuha, who was in the distance, once again emitted a bright sword light, and the huge sword cry sounded again. With a strange smile on her face, Zhang Yuha's figure disappeared into the flying sword again. In the entire space, all the spiritual energy of heaven and earth was suddenly swept up by her, setting off a tyrannical airflow that rushed into the flying sword like a whirlwind. Even Yu Qingtian himself couldn't stand still in midair. Hiss! Yu Qingtian sucked in a breath of cold air, and hurriedly pointed in the direction of the silver tiger. Unfortunately, the silver tiger's body emitted a strong silver light, but the spiritual energy of heaven and earth around it couldn't gather. It seemed that it couldn't compete with the suction force of the sword. Yu Qingtian was very anxious. Regardless of the fact that he was standing on one leg in midair, he waved his hands and cast a few more obscure spells. Dozens of light threads shot out from his hands, and shot toward the 6 directions of the Buddhist gold great array. Buzz, the light threads disappeared into the sky, and 6 places that couldn't be seen with the naked eye suddenly roared. A huge amount of golden spiritual energy of heaven and earth surged out, and was about to be sucked into the silver tiger. However, at this moment, the ka Ka sound was heard as Zhang Yuha's figure disappeared, and the huge sword expanded from the flying sword. Yu Qingtian scanned with his divine thoughts and saw that the layers of Tarsus silver threads that bound Zhang Yuha had been forced out of the flying sword by the dazzling sword light. Whether it was the sawtooth silver light or the blood-red sparks, they were now floating outside the sword light. Several silver threads were even broken inch by inch under the shroud of the sword light, and under the expansion of the huge sword. Yu Qingtian understood that it wasn't that Zhang Yuha didn't have the ability to resist, but that she used the Tarsus silver threads as bait to attract his attention, and use it to injure him with the six-direction sword spirit. This woman is really too cunning. Yu Qingtian shuddered, but he saw that the Tarsus silver threads were breaking like an avalanche, gradually expanding from a single point. All the silver threads were on the verge of breaking, and the ka sounds were continuous. Forget it. A trace of regret flashed in Yu Qingtian's eyes. He glanced at the huge sword and then at the six-direction sword spirit, who was using the sword light to devour the blood-red crystal, and was as thin as a sheet of paper. He said fiercely, "Even if this old man dies, I won't let you have your way." As he spoke, Yu Qingtian recited a strange incantation, and the blood-red light and black fog were emitted from his glabella again. Ha ha ha! Zhang Yuha's arrogance reverberated throughout the entire space. At this moment, she was indeed confident in her victory. Puff! There was an extremely soft sound, and a cloud of blood fog was emitted from Yu Qingtian's left arm. Yu Qingtian's left arm was completely gone, and this blood fog was formed from the flesh and blood of his left arm. Yu Qingtian's face was ghastly pale. He had lost his left arm and left leg in succession, and his physical body was greatly damaged. However, he still managed to stand in the air, and did his best. This was because he knew that Yu Tong was finished, but there were still thousands of disciples of the Yu family from Fallen Gold Mountain in this Buddhist gold formation. These disciples were now like fish waiting to be slaughtered by Zhang Yuha. Yu Qingtian was the only one who could save them. Go! As Yu Qingtian pointed his finger, the blood fog turned into a blood arrow and shot into the blood-red crystal. Zhang Yuha was currently breaking free from the tarsal silver threads, and the sword spirit of six harmonies did not receive Zhang Yuha's command. The blood fog fell into the crystal without any hindrance. With a swoosh, the blood-red color of the crystal shone brightly. However, the blood-red color was extremely bright, and it almost caused the two sword spirits to retreat slightly. Crack! There was another soft sound, and a crack appeared in the crystal. What are you doing? Zhang Yuha's voice was like a golden drum. At this moment, the tarsal silver threads had been completely covered by the sword light, and had escaped from the giant sword bang. There was a loud sound, and a thick, black fog of blood sprang out from the crystal. At the same time, the entire crystal broke into pieces and scattered in midair. As the crystal broke, the thousands of blood-red lights also disappeared. The small squares hanging from the blood-red lights slowly came to a stop. And just like before, they floated messily in the silver light. Damn it! Zhang Yuha was furious. Her whole body shook, and the shadow of a giant sword slashed out. It streaked across the air, and in an instant, it was in front of Yu Qingtian. Yu Qingtian was naturally prepared. With a wave of his hand, the silver shield blocked the giant sword once again. Rumble! There was a loud sound from the shield, as if a big machete had split open a cabbage. Even if the cabbage had complete leaves, it would still be split open. In the end, the cabbage could not withstand the sharpness of the machete. Seeing that the shield was split open so easily, Yu Qingtian was disheartened. The strength of a sword transformation swordsman was far from what he could resist. Chapter 2606. Wu, the giant sword continued to fall, and was about to split Yu Qingtian into two halves. Even the golden light protecting Yu Qingtian's body was trembling rapidly. At this critical moment, a clanging sound came from the bottom of the Buddhist gold great array Kong. It sounded like someone was knocking on the door, but it also sounded like someone was pounding on the door. Zhang Yuha was suddenly stunned. The giant sword stopped in midair, and Yu Qingtian took the opportunity to roll up a layer of silver light around his body. He suddenly disappeared from where he was, and after a while, He appeared several feet away. Escape technique? Zhang Yuha's divine sense swept over, and a strange look flashed in her eyes. Then, she swept her divine sense and gazed to the place where the sound came from. That was where Zhang Yuha and Yu Qingtian had just performed the blood sacrifice. And the sound came from one of the grids. Someone actually escaped the blood sacrifice? Not only was Zhang Yuha shocked, but Yu Qingtian was also stunned. With a loud bang, a huge gap suddenly appeared in the corner of the small grid. Then 2 rays of light, one green and one red, rushed out. Finally, an ordinary-looking cultivator jumped out of the gap with a 3-foot-long magic wand in his hand. Wasn't that Xiao Hua, who had finally escaped after the suction of the blood-colored crystal disappeared? Zhang Yuha's gaze swept past Xiao Hua, but it didn't stop there. Her gaze landed on the green and red brilliance of light with extreme surprise. Not only did Zhang Yuha's gaze fall on the sword gourd, but even the 6 directions sword spirit, who had opened its mouth to swallow the blood-colored crystal, stopped. Its eyes flashed, and its gaze showed instinctive resistance, contempt, and other expressions. Yin-yang sword gourd? Zhang Yuha couldn't help but groan. However, Zhang Yuha had just identified the yin-yang sword spirit when she saw Xiao Hua wave his Taoist robe. And the 2 sword gourds fell into his Taoist robe and disappeared. Fengying? Yu Qingtian looked at Xiao Hua's young face and the new Taoist robe in disbelief. You. How are you still alive? Yu Qingtian, who knew that the enemy was right in front of him, couldn't help but groan and ask. Xiao Hua put away the yin-yang sword gourd and scanned the place with his divine sense. He had already seen the whole situation clearly. Zhang Yuha? Why is she here? Furthermore, how did her cultivation suddenly transform into a sword? Motherfucker, it must be the result of this stupid blood sacrifice. Earlier on, I had been trying to guess Zhang Yuha's whereabouts with Zhang Qingxiao. Now, it seems that Zhang Yuha has really been held hostage by a Dao sect cultivator. However, this time it wasn't a cultivation sect, but a cultivation family. This war between Dao cultivators was really not started by Zhang Qingxiao alone. The Dao sect cultivators were also involved. Although Xiao Hua's heart tightened, he didn't dare to show any surprise on his face. He tightened his grip on the wishful staff, scratched his head, stretched out his left hand, and waved very hard. From his face he squeezed out a harmless smile. Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning, you two. I went to the wrong place. You continue. I will go out now. After saying that, Xiao Hua looked around and flew towards the edge of the blood sacrifice array. Haha, how interesting. Zhang Yuha's figure appeared in a flash from the giant sword. The sword light that was slashing toward Yu Qingtian did not dissipate. It was still condensed in the air, and its momentum was very oppressive. To be able to get out of the blood sacrifice array, your cultivation is really beyond this sword's expectations. Zhang Yuha didn't have the intention to let Xiao Hua go. However, since this sword has seen you, do you think you can easily escape from this sword's hands? Xiao Hua flew to the edge of the blood sacrifice array and looked at the silver brilliance near him. He turned around and smiled apologetically. This kid really came to the sword tomb to admire the purple jasmine flower. I came here purely because I was lost. This kid can make a blood oath. As for the matter between Master Huajian and this golden core stage senior, this kid didn't see anything. After this kid gets out of here, I will immediately return to Ming country, and will never come to the sword tomb again. Whether it is about Master Huajian or this golden core stage senior, this kid will definitely not say a word. Fellow Taoist Feng, Yu Qingtian hurriedly shouted. This old man doesn't know which master you are under. There was really a misunderstanding before. Fortunately, fellow Taoist didn't receive any injuries. This old man. Forget it. This old man won't say anything superfluous. As long as fellow Taoist helps this old man trim out this Huan country's sword, my falling gold mountains you family will be deeply grateful to fellow Taoist. If fellow Taoist wants anything from my falling gold mountain, this old man will definitely not say a word. I can even share everything that happened in the Washing Flower sect with fellow Taoist. The Washing Flower sect's vice sect masters have a really good relationship with my Yu family. In the future, my Yu family will take care of everything that fellow Taoist does in the Washing Flower sect. Senior you think too highly of this kid. Xiaohua hated Yu Qingtian to death. He actually exposed his lie in one breath. However, he still smiled bitterly. This kid is only a foundation establishment stage cultivator. You, a golden core stage cultivator, can't even deal with Master Huajian. What can this kid do? Just now, I was lucky enough to escape with my life. It was just a little secret technique of this kid. Don't drag this kid to his death. As he spoke, Xiaohua flew towards the silver light again. He knew that he had some methods, but against Zhang Yuhe, who had transformed into a sword, he really didn't have the confidence. Moreover, the most important thing was that he didn't want to get involved in the matter between Zhang Yuhe and Falling Gold Mountain. If he had the chance, he definitely wouldn't let go of Falling Gold Mountain. Do you want to stay out of this? Zhang Yuhe's figure flashed within the huge sword. Her human form and sword form were constantly switching, as if she was comprehending the realm of transforming into a sword, and also seemed to be familiarizing herself with the methods of transforming into a sword. Master Huajian. Hearing this, Xiaohua, who had just flown a few feet, stopped again. Now that you already have the upper hand and this kid is harmless to you, you can go back to Huan country and never meet this kid again. Why can't you have the virtue of cherishing life and let this kid off lightly? Moreover, at this time, the battle between the Dao cultivators outside the sword tomb is in full swing. Wouldn't it be better for you to go out and kill a few more golden core stage cultivators and help the sword cultivators win? There's no reason for you to waste useless time with this kid here. Xiaohua was now earnestly advising, just like an eager father and mother advising an unfilial descendant who didn't want to contribute to the country. And what you said is also reasonable. Zhang Yuhe looked at Yu Qingtian, who had almost lost half of his flesh, and nodded. To this sword, it really doesn't matter to me whether I kill you or not. Many thanks, Master Huajian. Xiaohua was overjoyed and quietly flew a few feet. But Zhang Yuhe's tone changed. Xiaohua's heart tightened, and he anxiously said, Master Huajian, what else do you want? Nothing. Zhang Yuhe smiled. This sword just wants to remind you that you are now inside the Buddhist gold great array. Without this sword or Yu Qingtian's help, I'm afraid it will be difficult for you to get out of this great array. Is that so? Then what should I do? Xiaohua's hand slightly swung the wishful wand. Although your wand is powerful and can break the blood sacrifices nest, if you want to break this great array, you need the silver tiger controlling the great array. Zhang Yuhe said with a smile. Xiaohua scratched his head again and smiled bitterly. Senior Yu, I'm afraid you won't open the array, right? Master Huajian, what do you mean? This sword is telling you this because I want to negotiate with you. Zhang Yuhe smiled. This sword will tear a gap in this great array and let you out, but you have to pay this sword a reward. Oh, what reward? Xiaohua was stunned. He really didn't expect Zhang Yuhe to let him out. Naturally, it's the yin-yang sword gourd you just took, Zhang Yuhe said without hiding anything. This thing is still very useful to this sword. If you take it out, this sword will let you live and tear the great array. So that's how it is. Xiaohua's gaze swept and saw the two sword spirits swallowing the blood mist. Although he didn't know why these two things were in the image of Yutong and Zhang Yuhe, the crimson and azure sword light was the sword light of the yin-yang sword gourd that day. It seems, these two people used the blood of cultivators to refine. It's these two sword spirits. Xiaohua had already understood, but he still hesitated. Master Huajian, are you talking about the two green and red gourds just now? Yes, it's that thing. Zhang Yuhe nodded. This sword is very curious. This thing is the yin-yang sword gourd of sword cultivators. Where did you get it? Hee, Master Huajian, then what is the use of this so-called sword gourd? Xiaohua didn't answer but asked instead. What are you pretending for in front of this sword? Zhang Yuhe didn't hesitate to remove Xiaohua's disguise. This sword will tell you, do you dare to listen? I don't dare, it's all this little one's mouth. Xiaohua hurriedly clapped his hands and took out the yin-yang sword gourd. With one in each hand, he held it up and smiled apologetically. This little one picked it up from somewhere else. Since it's a sword cultivator's item, this little one has no use for it. If I can use it to exchange for my life, this little one will naturally be happy. This little one will now give this whatever sword gourd to Master Huajian, but please make a blood oath. In the distance, Yu Qingtian didn't seem careless because he was ignored. He snorted coldly from his nostrils, looking down on Xiaohua's cautiousness very much. He almost told Xiaohua that sword cultivators use sword oaths and not blood oaths. But Zhang Yuhe was also straightforward. She said coldly, "This sword has never made any blood oath. If I want to make a blood oath, it's my sword realm's sword oath. However, do you think a foundation establishment cultivator like you is worthy of a sword transformation swordsman making a sword oath? Just now, this sword saw that you had the yin-yang sword gourd, so I didn't suddenly kill you. Do you think a foundation establishment cultivator can dodge this sword?" While she was speaking, the flying sword not far from Yu Qingtian let out a clear clang sound, seemingly agreeing with Zhang Yuhe's words. Xiaohua pondered for a moment and said with a smile, "This little one naturally understands. This little one doesn't need Master's sword oath or blood oath. This little one will hand over the sword gourd to Master. I ask Master to let this little one live." Saying this, Xiaohua quietly pressed his 2 thumbs on the sword gourd. With a shake of his hand, he sent it into the air. When the 2 sword gourds left Xiaohua's hands, the scarlet and azure sword light slightly flashed, seemingly concealing something. Chapter 2607. However, this sword light didn't attract anyone's attention. "Ha, not bad, not bad. You're much more tactful than Yu Qingtian." Zhang Yuhe laughed. "Since you're so cooperative with me, how can I not send you on your way?" With that, Zhang Yuhe waved her hand, and 2 sword gourds quickly fell into her hands. Zhang Yuhe struck several sword seals on the sword gourds, and the sword gourds emitted extremely brilliant sword light. The scarlet and azure colors were as dazzling as the sun and the moon. This seems to be the clear sword sex sacrificial refining technique. How can you pick it up so easily?" Zhang Yuhe whispered in a strange tone. Although Xiaohua heard her voice echoing in the silent Buddhist gold great array, he turned a deaf ear and didn't intend to answer. Of course, Zhang Yuhe didn't expect an answer from him. Zhang Yuhe pointed with her finger, and a pure, crystal-like azure sword light flew out. The sword light was extremely thin, and it was extremely similar to the crystal thread that came out from the sword intent. The sword light landed on the 6 directions in spirit's glabella, and the 6 directions in spirit immediately became sluggish and motionless like a puppet. "Go!" Zhang Yuhe scolded softly, and the azure sword gourd streaked across the air and covered the sword spirit. "Return!" Zhang Yuhe shook the sword light in her hand, and the 6 directions in spirit's body began to turn into light and slowly rushed into the azure sword gourd. The sword gourd twisted extremely, and gradually, a human-shaped gourd slowly appeared. That Master Huajian Xiaohua saw that Zhang Yuhe actually ignored him, and began to sacrificial refine the sword gourd, so he coughed and said, "Master, let me go. You have plenty of time to do the things you love." Zhang Yuhe snorted coldly and ignored Xiaohua. As usual, she followed the gourd's pattern and pointed her finger. A similar crystal thread came out of the scarlet light next to her, but the crystal thread was extremely thin and couldn't be seen clearly. Similarly, the 6 directions in spirit in the shape of the jade symbol was also sluggish like a puppet when the crystal thread pierced its glabella, allowing the scarlet sword gourd to slowly absorb it. "Are you going to leave? Don't you want me to send you on your way?" Seeing that everything was over, Zhang Yuhe was perfectly satisfied. She looked at Xiaohua, who had quietly flown several feet away. Hearing this, Xiaohua hurriedly stopped, and somewhat awkwardly smiled apologetically. "Master Huajian, you are currently doing what you love to do, this little one. It's better not to disturb you. If I can walk by myself, it's better to walk by myself. I don't want to trouble you. How can you not take my words seriously?" Zhang Yuhe sneered, as if she was angry. Her whole body shook, and a sharp sword light flashed, piercing towards Xiaohua. Xiaohua felt that this flying sword was even faster than his punishing dream and mountain splitter. He unconsciously shrunk his neck and wanted to dodge. Fortunately, this sword light wasn't aimed at Xiaohua. Instead, it hit the silver light screen. With a swoosh, a crack as big as a person was torn open. Xiao Hua was overjoyed. He didn't dare to bow and hurriedly flew towards the crack. He still shouted, "Many thanks, Master Huajian. This little one was resting in the sword tomb today, and had a golden millet dream. I didn't see anything." Zhang Yuhe didn't pay attention to him, and turned to look at Yu Qingtian. Yu Qingtian stood there, trembling. He was in an extremely sorry and miserable state. When he saw Zhang Yuhe looking at him, he begged, "Little friend Zhang, this old man has cooperated with you for several decades. For you, I even bet my falling gold mountain's reputation and future. I used 100,000 lives to help you refine the great Yin-Yang Six Directions sword spirit. If this were to be known by the cultivators of the 3 cultivation countries, not even dregs of my falling gold mountain would be left. Little friend, you can even let go of this unfamiliar washing flower sect disciple. Why can't you let this old man go on account of our cooperation for several decades?" Washing flower sect. Zhang Yuhe frowned and hurriedly turned her head. She saw that Xiao Hua had already flown to the edge of the crack. At this moment, Zhang Yuhe shook her hand without the slightest hesitation. Woo! An extremely strong sword cry resounded from outside the crack. Shua! A sword light that could split a mountain peak chopped toward Xiao Hua. Fight! Xiao Hua had long been prepared for this. He raised the wishful staff in his hand. Dang! A huge sound rang out. The sword light was actually blocked by him, and his figure was also shaken down by more than 10 feet. However, a strange thing happened. Xiao Hua's figure suddenly disappeared in midair. There was no trace of him at all. Zhang Yuhe coldly snorted. The huge sword light let out a sword cry and blocked the crack that had just been torn open. Boom! A huge sound rang out, and a deep depression appeared not far away from the sword light. Go! As Zhang Yuhe pinched her sword, the flying sword drew an arc and stabbed towards the depression. However, as the flying sword passed through the void, it was unable to do much damage. However, after the flying sword left, the crack on the silver light screen quickly closed up. In the space, not far from the gap that had just closed, Xiao Hua's figure gradually appeared. Xiao Hua held the wishful staff in his hand and looked coldly at Zhang Yuhe. He said faintly, "Master Huajian, what do you mean by this? Didn't you just promise I? Why did you suddenly change your mind?" Change my mind? Do I need a reason? This sword is willing. Zhang Yuhe smiled and said, "This sword is a woman. A woman's words, can you take it seriously? If you take a woman's word seriously, then you have lost. You are Senior Huajian." After listening to Zhang Yuhe's words, Xiao Hua almost fell from midair. Xiao Hua really didn't expect Zhang Yuhe to be so fickle. She was really far from the swordsman in his impression of the Wuxian assembly. So what if I am Senior Huajian? Zhang Yuhe sneered. This sword is a woman first, and then a swordsman. Do women need a reason to do things? After listening to Zhang Yuhe's words, the image of another female Jindan stage cultivator flashed in Xiao Hua's mind very quickly. If it was not Chini, who could it be? It seems whether it is a female cultivator or a female swordsman, there will always be some unreasonable. Xiao Hua was really speechless. Even in this flash, he thought of the first time he saw Shui in Yinyuan City. At that time, wasn't Shui generally unreasonable? Xiao Hua said a few words, but he didn't say anything. He knew that Zhang Yuhe had changed her mind and didn't want to let him out. His 2 yin-yang sword gourds were wasted. He was afraid that he would have to fight to the death with this Master Huajian. Thinking of this, Xiao Hua naturally put away his previous apologetic smile. He waved the wishful staff in his hand and patted his forehead. The pressure that was very similar to that of a Jindan stage cultivator was slowly released, and he himself slowly flew in the direction of Yu Qingtian. He knew in his heart that although he was extremely disgusted with Yu Qingtian, and because of some of Yu Qingtian's words just now, he didn't know whether it was intentional or unintentional, which made Zhang Yuhe suspicious and cut off his way out. However, at this time, only he and Yu Qingtian were facing Zhang Yuhe. He had no choice but to cooperate with Yu Qingtian. At this time, Yu Qingtian's physical body had been greatly damaged. As a Jindan stage cultivator, His cultivation might not be in Xiaohua's eyes. However, everyone was inside the Brahma Gold Formation. Obviously, Yu Qingtian was the key to controlling the Brahma Gold Formation, and the Silver Tiger, which was still roaring in the air, was probably the center of the formation. Xiaohua had no choice but to compromise with Yu Qingtian. Of course, Xiaohua had another plan for approaching Yu Qingtian so closely. Sure enough, when he saw that Xiaohua was actually a Jindan stage cultivator and was even approaching him, Yu Qingtian was simply overjoyed. He didn't have time to think about Xiaohua's purpose in coming here. With a wave of his hand, the Silver Tiger flew in front of him. He landed on it easily, and the Silver Tiger turned into a stream of light and pounced on Xiaohua. Yu Qingtian, who was on the Silver Tiger, hurriedly shouted, "Fellow Daoist Feng, you and I will fight the enemy together. What I said before still stands." Xiaohua stared at Zhang Yuhe and occasionally glanced at Yu Qingtian from the corner of his eyes. He didn't answer Yu Qingtian's temptation. He could take the things from the falling gold mountain, but he wasn't interested in protecting the falling gold mountain at all. Moreover, he also knew in his heart that how could Zhang Yuhe make Yu Qingtian join forces with him? If Yu Qingtian hadn't called him back, he might have been able to struggle at death's door for a while, or even, he might have been able to preserve his life under Yu Qingtian's flowery words. But at that time, Yu Qingtian was really blinded. He was afraid that the matter of the blood sacrifice would be exposed to the Huanhua sect, so he spoke out to make him stay. Although he had no way to survive, he had no choice but to cooperate with Yu Qingtian to face Zhang Yuhe. But on the other hand, didn't Yu Qingtian personally push him to the edge of the cliff? Faced with a Jindan stage cultivator who was in good condition and a Jindan stage cultivator whose physical body was greatly damaged, it was obvious how Zhang Yuhe would decide. This was also the reason why Xiaohua released his spiritual aura as soon as he turned around and flew toward Yu Qingtian. A Jindan stage cultivator? Interesting. A trace of astonishment flashed through Zhang Yuhe's eyes, but she immediately sneered. Indeed, a Jindan stage cultivator was nothing in the eyes of Hua Jian. However, when she saw Yu Qingtian riding the Silver Tiger to meet up with Xiaohua, she sneered. It was exactly as Xiaohua thought. How could she let Yu Qingtian join forces with Xiaohua? Even if it was a cultivator who was struggling at death's door, it wouldn't work. Go to hell, Zhang Yuhe scolded softly. Sword light flashed around her body, and two flying sword phantoms rushed out. One slashed toward Yu Qingtian, and the other slashed toward Xiaohua. This Huajian's sword light was extremely powerful. Just as it was born, an incomparably turbulent sharp qi rushed toward them. Even the sword light seemed to be able to cross space, and all of a sudden, it arrived in front of Xiaohua and Yu Qingtian. "Fight!" Xiaohua roared. He suddenly raised the wishful steel staff, and hit it toward the flying sword. With a loud rumbling sound, thousands of sword light fragments scattered in the air. Zhang Yuhe's sword light was actually scattered by Xiaohua, and Xiaohua himself, under the huge force of the flying sword, flew diagonally in the direction behind Yu Qingtian. Chapter 2608. When Yu Qingtian saw that the sword light was about to strike him, he formed a seal with his hands. After a silver light flashed, his figure disappeared from the Silver Tiger. Ah? Gold. Gold escape? Xiaohua, who was already extremely proficient in escape techniques, could tell at a glance that the secret technique Yu Qingtian used was not some concealment technique, but an escape technique he was familiar with. At this moment, Yu Qingtian was absolutely right to use the gold escape technique. He no longer had any power to resist, and even his defense was barely satisfactory. All he could do was dodge. However, Yu Qingtian made a second fatal mistake. Although his figure disappeared and Zhang Yuhe's flying sword chopped down, Silver Tiger still did not receive any damage from this flying sword. However, the Silver Tiger was still flying in the air, and it was flying in the direction of Xiaohua. Sure enough, after a moment, Yu Qingtian's figure appeared less than 1,000 feet in front of Xiaohua, and the Silver Tiger obediently stopped under him. Alas, be careful, fellow Taoist Yu. Seeing that Yu Qingtian really appeared not far from him and really appeared on the Silver Tiger, Xiaohua sighed and could not help but remind him. Fellow Taoist? Yu Qingtian was a little puzzled. Zhang Yuha's flying sword had clearly just struck the air and dissipated in the distance, but he still hurriedly released his divine thoughts. However, at the same time, the sword light that Zhang Yuha had condensed in midair had quietly followed the silver tiger's flight and slashed horizontally behind Yu Qingtian's back. Fellow Taoist, save me! Yu Qingtian was horrified. As he shouted, his figure desperately flew toward Xiaohua, and he formed a seal with his hands desperately. However, Xiaohua had no intention of saving him at all. At this time, the flying sword that had been condensed suddenly struck him, and his whole body was imprisoned. Before Yu Qingtian's gold escape technique could be launched, the flying sword had already slashed horizontally at his back. All the armor and golden light that protected his body could not withstand the sword of a swordsman. Yu Qingtian only let out a loud cry before his waist was split in two. The flying sword was so sharp and powerful, but Yu Qingtian's figure was still intact, and the silver tiger was still flying with him. However, in the blink of an eye, the silver light around the silver tiger trembled violently and was gradually annihilated. The ferocious phantom from just now was gradually absorbed into the celestial artifact and returned to an ordinary celestial artifact. It followed the inertia of Yu Qingtian's corpse and floated toward Xiaohua. Buzz, at Zhang Yuha's location, a sword light soared into the sky and flew toward the silver tiger like a big hand. Humph, Xiaohua sneered, and his figure suddenly moved. Almost like a phantom, he floated toward the silver tiger like a ghost. A gust of wind blew past, and Xiaohua's figure appeared on the left side of the silver tiger. He stretched out his hand and was about to grab the silver tiger. For Xiaohua's wind escape technique, a distance of several hundred feet was really a long time. At this time, Zhang Yuha's sword light had just flown a distance of several hundred feet. However, just as Xiaohua's finger was about to fall on the silver tiger suddenly turned into a rainbow and flew toward the area of 9 houses in the distance. It seemed that someone was coveting it from the side. Where are you going? Xiaohua sneered, and the heaven and earth sleeve covered the silver tiger. Although the silver tiger struggled violently, could it defeat Xiaohua, who was like a tiger and a wolf? Xiaohua wrapped the silver tiger with his mind and sent it into the space. Not only that, after Xiaohua received the silver tiger, his small hand easily reached out and nimbly took off the storage bag on Yu Qingtian's corpse. Seeing that Xiaohua was actually so greedy, Zhang Yuha's sword light shone brightly. With a buzz, it flashed and slashed toward his face. Ha ha ha, Xiaohua laughed and roared. You're looking for a beating. Then, without hesitation, he waved the wishful staff, and the staff's shadow hit the mountain-like sword shadow with earth-shattering force. Rumble, there was a tremor like an earthquake, and Xiaohua's figure was sent flying obliquely like a bullet. However, Zhang Yuha's sword attack was defeated by Xiaohua once again. After the sound, the whole space was silent for a while. Zhang Yuha's attack was suspended, and Yu Qingtian's corpse had fallen to the bottom of the silver brilliance, piled together with the corpses of the blood sacrifice cultivators that he had used every possible means to attract. Those corpses even had their own small lattice as a coffin. However, Yu Qingtian's corpse was split in half, and no one paid any attention to it. Xiaohua held the wishful staff in his hand and stared at Zhang Yuha in the distance like a tiger watching its prey. At the same time, he was somewhat thoughtful. In this moment, Xiaohua received 3 attacks from Zhang Yuha. Although Zhang Yuha sent Xiaohua flying each time, and each attack was more powerful than the last, there was also a limit to this power. For Xiaohua, this kind of attack was even inferior to Qin Jian's, who was only at the 3rd grade of the illusory sword realm. Of course, when Qin Jian faced Xiaohua, he also used the sword transformation secret technique. His attack was comparable to the sword transformation secret technique, but after all, he was comparable to the sword transformation secret technique. His attack could only be inferior to Zhang Yuha's sword transformation secret technique, and it was impossible for him to surpass Zhang Yuha's sword transformation secret technique. So why was Zhang Yuha's attack so weak? On the one hand, Zhang Yuha's attack was not weak. She cut Yu Qingtian, who had the strength of a gold core, in half with one sword. The sharpness of that sword light was evident. However, this kind of sharpness was against Xiaohua's wishful staff. and it was absolutely difficult to produce the kind of power that could kill Yu Qingtian. The biggest effect of this attack was to send Xiaohua flying, and it couldn't even hurt a single hair on Xiaohua's body. On the other hand, Zhang Yuha's attacks hadn't transformed into swords, nor did they contain any sword intent. They were purely strands of sword light. Yet these strands of sword light were capable of blasting Xiaohua flying. This proved that Zhang Yuha's strength was far from what it appeared to be. It's just, why didn't Zhang Yuha use her killing move? Thinking about the shocking attack of the old man who had transformed into a sword on Foul Crow Mountain, Xiaohua shuddered and looked at Zhang Yuha with vigilance. When Xiaohua quietly swept his Buddhist awareness over the continuously shrinking lotus sword intent, as well as the crystal threads connected to Zhang Yuha's forehead, and even the crimson ball of light near Zhang Yuha's left side, as well as the six-direction sword spirit that was merging with the yin-yang sword gourd, Xiaohua suddenly came to a realization. This fiend. I'm afraid she has just stepped into the sword transformation secret technique, and is still at the stage of the fusion of sword intent and sword spirit, the sword heart required for the sword transformation secret technique. She has yet to condense it. Otherwise, I'm afraid she would have already chased after me. Also, what kind of sword spirit did she refine? Why is it so similar to the yin-yang sword spirit? Right now, that sword gourd. Is it being swallowed by her two sword spirits? At the critical moment? She doesn't dare to stay away? Xiaohua's mind instantly calculated several times, and he finally understood. If I don't catch her off guard now, when will I? If I let her refine this sword spirit and consolidate the sword transformation secret technique, how can this young master survive? Thinking of this, Xiaohua clapped his hands and took out the seal of turning the sea. He urged his spiritual power, and a buzzing sound could be heard. The seal of turning the sea suddenly expanded, and the coiling dragon on the seal was overflowing with light and color, rolling up the spiritual energy of heaven and earth in the surrounding dozens of feet. Go! As Xiaohua pointed his finger, the coiling dragon roared and flew from the seal. It circled around the seal, opened its hand, held the seal in its mouth, and rushed toward Zhang Yuha. Xiaohua urged the wind escape technique to follow behind the seal of turning the sea like a shadow. He held the wishful staff in his hand, and wanted to fly to Zhang Yuha's left side. Oh! Seeing the power of the seal of turning the sea, Zhang Yuha was a little stunned. The coiling dragon's body was rolling with muffled thunder, as if heavenly thunder had streaked across the sky. Although it hadn't come close, that kind of indescribable confinement force had already come, making her sword heart that was in the process of condensing ripples of fear. She couldn't help but be surprised. What a strange boy! Zhang Yuha's golden voice sounded. The Huanhua sect actually has such a background. No wonder they dared to support the blood sacrifice of 100,000 creatures in Falling Gold Mountain. Xiaohua didn't want to be long-winded with her. He urged his spiritual power again. Roar! The coiling dragon roared again, and the seal in its mouth spat out, attacking Zhang Yuha. Humph! Although Zhang Yuha was surprised, she was still relaxed. She raised her hand and an azure sword light flew out. With a rumbling sound, it really hit the seal. Xiaohua's seal, which was able to send the flowing ice valley's hard rock flying for several zhang, actually let out a rumbling sound when it came into contact with this thumb-thin sword light. It violently tumbled, and was blocked in midair by that sword light. Fight! Xiaohua was not discouraged. He chanted incantations and his hands continuously formed seals. While the seals were tumbling, they fell with a rumbling sound. After several times, they actually managed to defeat the sword light. Hee, ignorant child, how can you know the methods of a sword cultivator? Zhang Yuha didn't find it strange. She put her hands together and rubbed them slightly. It was as if a shiny lotus flower appeared in her hands out of thin air. Dozens of sword lights flashed brightly, forming a lotus flower, and slowly flew into the air. Above the lotus flower, the sword lights expanded and contracted in different directions, swallowing and spitting out, covering an area of dozens of feet. Fight! Xiaohua urged the seal of turning sea again. Although the sealing power of the seal of turning sea was extremely strong, and the sword lights flickered under the seal of turning sea, these dozens of sword lights were like a sword formation, or perhaps a hole. All the sword lights rotated and alternately blocked the seal of turning sea in midair. After several heavy blows, the scattered sword lights were blocked by other sword lights, and the sword lights gradually recovered in a short moment. Transforming into a sword is really unexpected. Xiao Hua's eyes narrowed slightly, carefully understanding the difference between the transforming sword swordsman and the illusory sword swordsman. After the fusion of the sword intent and the sword spirit, the sword intent is rarely used to drive the sword chi. Instead, the sword light is directly used. I'm afraid that the sword heart is used to control the sword. This seems to be the essence of the flying sword. Watch this young master, Xiao Hua thought as his figure flew in front of the sword light of the lotus flower. With a woo sound, he waved the wishful steel staff and smashed it on the sword light. Boom! A hole as thick as a bowl appeared in the sword light. It was the wishful steel staff that smashed it. Chapter 2609. Swish! Zhang Yuha didn't even raise her eyebrows. She flicked her finger, and a sharp sword light appeared, stabbing towards that flaw. But at the same time, Xiao Hua also released his hand, and a faint golden light flashed, stabbing into that flaw at an extremely fast speed. Ka! Zhang Yuha's sword light was actually cut by that golden light. The golden light didn't lose its momentum, and still rushed towards Zhang Yuha. Huh! Zhang Yuha was slightly surprised. When she saw that the golden light was half a pair of scissors, she frowned, as if she thought of something. However, the scissors were like lightning. The sharp Tingjiao scissors swung its tail, and it was already less than 2 zhang away from Zhang Yuha. Zhang Yuha clenched her hand again, and a ball of azure brilliance appeared in her palm. That brilliance was like a lotus seed. Go! Zhang Yuha raised her hand, and that brilliance flew out of her hand. Swish swish, the lotus seed seemed to swell with the wind. After a few flashes, another lotus similar to the brilliance around her body shot out sword light in all directions, blocking the Tingjiao scissors. This lotus was like a hedgehog that rushed towards the Tingjiao scissors. In an instant, the Tingjiao scissors flashing with golden light was knocked 1 zhang away. Although your strength has reached the late gold core stage, this magic weapon is also powerful. Zhang Yuha sneered. But there is still some distance between this sword and this sword. Playing in front of this sword, isn't it a bit lacking? Damn it. Zhang Yuha seemed to have just stepped into the sword transformation stage, and intended to use Xiao Hua to practice. She was somewhat calm and unruffled as she explained to Xiao Hua. But just as she said this, she cried out in alarm again. She saw the Tingjiao scissors flash with a golden light in midair, chopping towards the sword intent that had already turned into an azure lotus and the crystal thread that was next to it. Following Zhang Yuha's cry of alarm, another brilliance flashed from Zhang Yuha's hand. The Tingjiao scissors was hit by the brilliant sword light, and was once again sent flying high into the air. However, the Tingjiao scissors was like a naughty child. At this moment, it suddenly stopped being naughty. With a roar, it suddenly turned into a dragon and rushed at the crystal thread between Zhang Yuha's eyebrows. It was the crystal thread that was connected to the green lotus with countless flashing sword talismans, and a faint green brilliance flowing around it. This crystal thread was close to the Tingjiao shears that had been sent flying. Only now did Zhang Yuha understand what Xiao Hua was thinking. Only now did she know the true intention of Xiao Hua's soaring dragon shears to break through her sword intent. Xiao Hua's attack was clearly premeditated. Moreover, the sharpness of the soaring dragon scissors was far greater than before. The golden light flashed and immediately arrived in front of the crystal thread. The murderous golden light had already touched the sword essence on the crystal thread. You bastard! Zhang Yuha's expression suddenly changed. She no longer had her previous carefree expression. This crystal thread was clearly her greatest weakness right now. Moreover, this attack was far beyond her expectations. After all, the crystal thread was right between her eyebrows. It was really a distance that could be reached by raising one's hand. Attack! The sword light around Zhang Yuha's body flourished. She spat out the small life sword that had previously injured Yu Qingtian with a whoosh. It really struck the Tingjiao shears like a bolt of lightning. Almost at the same time Zhang Yuhe spat out the small life sword. The small life sword appeared near the Tung Jiao shears. It was somewhat similar to a nascent soul cultivator's nascent soul teleportation. The Tung Jiao shears and the small life sword collided. With a crack, Zhang Yuhe's small life sword was unexpectedly sent flying. Although the Tung Jiao shears' flying momentum was blocked, the golden light swept past and cut the crystal thread. Buzz the green light on the small life sword flourished. Immediately, countless sword runes and sword lights flew out from the lotus sword intent and merged with the small life sword. The small life sword was mixed with Zhang Yuhe's anger as it pounced on the Tung Jiao shears. How could Zhang Yuhe not be angry? The golden light of the Tung Jiao shears flashed, and the green and red crystal threads overflowing from the sword runes were instantly cut. Dozens of broken sword runes slid down from the crystal threads like dripping blood and drifted in the air. As the crystal thread was cut, the red ball of light that was originally frozen suddenly began to move. It was like a recovering heart, and the sword symbol on it also gradually became alive. Damn it! Zhang Yuhe urged the small life sword to resist the Tung Jiao shears. Her two hands were originally going to stretch out and transform into swords to catch the Tung Jiao shears, but at this moment, she was helpless. She struck out with the sword art in her hands, and sword lights turned into green sword runes that fell on the two broken crystal threads, wrapping them up. As for the crystal threads on her glabella, they were hidden in the air again. At the same time, the green lotus turned into a green light ball. The sword runes on it swelled and the brilliance boiled, just like the crimson light ball bang. Another loud sound. The Tung Jiao shears wailed, and the golden light around it faded. It could no longer maintain the illusion of a dragon, and turned into half a pair of shears that stopped in the air. Seeing that Zhang Yuhe was flustered by his Tung Jiao shears, Xiaohua's little tail was already raised to the sky. Just as the thought of sword transformation swordsman is only SOSO arose, the Tung Jiao shears was hit by Zhang Yuhe's small life sword. Xiaohua sucked in a breath of cold air. Ever since he obtained the Tung Jiao shears, he had always been invincible. Even illusory swords had to suffer under his Tung Jiao shears, but he had never been beaten out of his original form by others. Sword transformation swordsman is indeed powerful. Xiaohua couldn't help but sigh, but before his sigh dissipated, he saw that near the Tung Jiao shears, countless green sword lights were shining. They were like the small life sword's little friends that surrounded the Tung Jiao shears, wanting to beat it out. Not good. Xiaohua suddenly felt that his connection with the Tung Jiao shears was weakening. He couldn't help but turn pale with fright. Although this thing was incomparably sharp and was very powerful as a magic weapon, it was still lost. Xiaohua's heart was in pain. But this thing was seen by Feng Buping, that guy's messaging talisman. If Zhang Yuhe obtained it and brought it back to Huan country, wouldn't that be terrible? Wouldn't Xiaohua be chased by Feng Buping's teacher? Xiaohua panicked and hurriedly clapped his hands. Go! Seeing a blue wave falling from the sky, the primordial water in the clear water bottle fell down like a vast sky, surrounding Zhang Yuhe's flashing sword lights. That monstrous wave, under the control of Xiaohua's Buddhist seal, rushed towards the Tung Jiao shears like a swarm of bees. The primordial water was indeed powerful. Under the heavy pressure and under the strong corrosion, Zhang Yuhe's sword lights were compressed by a lot. Even the places where it came in contact with the primordial water were filled with many tiny bubbles. The previously weakened connection became clear again under Xiaohua's surprise attack. Xiaohua no longer dared to hesitate. He urged the Tung Jiao shears to once again turn into a golden light and fly back. In this moment, the two light balls, one green and one red, had already begun to swell together. Although the crystal wires that were blown apart by Xiaohua didn't overflow with sword lights, the sword talisman he took out was already flashing with red and green brilliance. The surrounding sword talismans were also gradually shining. Humph! What a powerful cultivator! Zhang Yuhe's pink face became even more ashen. In her eyes, there was a bit of astonishment mixed with shame and anger. You can actually control 3 magic weapons at the same time? No, as long as it was an ordinary cultivator, their divine sense was limited. They could only take out and control 1 magic weapon. Only a few people with strong divine sense could control 2 magic weapons. Xiaohua had already taken out 2 magic weapons before. He could be counted as one of the few. However, this still couldn't make Zhang Yuhe shocked. However, when the third magic weapon was taken out, Zhang Yuhe could no longer remain calm. Primordial water. Even if it was just one magic weapon, ordinary cultivators wouldn't be able to control it, let alone 3 magic weapons? This young master has a lot of divine abilities. You just wait to taste them one by one. Xiaohua laughed nastily. This concubine is so scared. Zhang Yuhe immediately referred to herself as a concubine. She even reached out her hand and patted her chest. That cute and lovable appearance was no different from Zhang Yutong's. However, Zhang Yuhe was like an awakened viper. As soon as the hand that was patting her soft chest left her skin, a resplendent sword light immediately flashed. That sword light was like the first light of dawn, extremely fast flying towards the Tungjiao shears. A powerful suction force was born from the sword light. Damn it, I poked a hornet's nest. Xiaohua bitterly smiled. He raised his Buddha's Sarira and a mountain-like wave rose from the primordial water, hitting that sword light with earth-shattering force. You can also control primordial water? Zhang Yuhe saw that the wave of water heavily pressed down on her sword light. She knew that this primordial water was by no means the transformation of a trace of primordial water, and the control of so much primordial water was something she didn't know. She couldn't help but feel a little more astonished. It seemed that there was a kind of emotion called regret growing in her heart at this time. If she hadn't left Xiaohua behind, at this time in this Buddhist gold great array, she would have been the only one condensing her sword heart. What a pleasant place to be. Who told her to have a little more thought, leaving Xiaohua behind? Not to mention that the silver tiger of the Buddhist gold great array was unknowingly taken away by Xiaohua. Not to mention that the condensation of her sword heart was disturbed. Even this bullshit primordial water great array gave her a headache, right? Seeing that the wave was like a fist, hitting the sword light, the whole sword light was extremely flickering. It was actually more powerful than Xiaohua's wishful staff. In particular, the primordial water was extremely corrosive and pervasive, penetrating through the sword light. Seeing that the sword light protecting her body was damaged, Zhang Yuhe didn't dare to be careless. She opened her almond-shaped eyes wide and took a deep breath. Buzz, a huge roar sounded, and her figure disappeared again. A giant sword appeared, and at this time, the sword light was slightly blue. With the appearance of the giant sword, that kind of oppressive sword power was born again, forcing Xiaohua to retreat more than 10 feet. The sword light of the giant sword was like a ray of light, covering the previous sword light, and even piercing the primordial water a few feet away. Fortunately, Xiaohua took advantage of Zhang Yuhe's distraction and hurriedly put the soaring dragon shears into the space, and also the seal of turning the sea that had been unable to do anything. Zhang Yuhe transformed into a flying sword, and also made up her mind to kill Xiaohua on the spot, and then concentrate on condensing her sword heart. The giant sword had already appeared, and the dazzling sword light filled the whole space. The sword chi on the giant sword stirred up the spiritual chi of heaven and earth, and even the primordial water was surging in this sword chi. Chapter 26:10. Brat, look at this sword's attack. Zhang Yuhe's voice didn't contain any emotion, but the anger in it was obvious. The sound of a golden chime reverberated through the entire space. Then the huge sword slowly rose. An irresistible and unparalleled sword force was sandwiched in the sword chi and enveloped Xiaohua from afar. Immediately, Xiaohua felt powerless, as if his whole body was restricted. Sure enough, it's sword transformation. I don't need to use any sword intent at all. I can rely on this flying sword to defeat the enemy in one strike. Xiaohua sighed. However, his eyes focused. With a clap of his hand, many fire talismans appeared in his hand. Zhang Yuhe's huge sword seemed to strike very slowly, but Xiaohua's innate primordial water was completely enveloped by this huge sword. Xiaohua's Buddha Sarira did its utmost to control the primordial water, but under the sword aura of the huge sword, it was difficult to create any ripples. Boom! The seemingly slow but actually swift strike created a several zhang-wide gap in the innate primordial water. Xiaohua's Buddha Sarira slightly swayed, unable to resist this sword that could even split Rooster Cry Mountain. Sword transformation. Sword transformation. Sword transformation. Truly facing this sword transformation attack, Xiaohua naturally understood his own shallowness that day. This sword transformation attack seemed to have condensed some indescribable mysteries. As early as the moment the huge sword split the innate primordial water, Xiaohua already felt his entire body was completely confined. He couldn't use any kind of true essence or any kind of magic art. His entire heart was completely pierced by the small sword in advance, and an indescribable throbbing was born in his heart. Moreover, this sword transformation attack seemed to have broken free from the constraints of space. Just as it flashed around the innate primordial water, it immediately appeared in front of Xiaohua. At the same time, Xiaohua's Taoist robe was destroyed by the fluttering sword aura. The golden light protecting his body rapidly flashed. Xiaohua was very anxious. He really didn't expect that he would be so weak in front of the sword transformation attack. This sword hadn't fallen yet, and he had already been defeated. Xiaohua's body began to flicker with brilliance, and the faint sound of thunder could be heard. Xiaohua wasn't willing to sit and wait for death. He wanted to use Imperial Thunder Travel to escape from the giant sword's envelopment. However, that confining sword force was too strong. Although Xiaohua's strength was comparable to the late stage of the core formation realm, and he could even face nascent soul cultivators head-on, he was still only at the peak of the late stage of the foundation establishment realm. It really wasn't easy for him to escape from this sword transformation. Even though he managed to activate his powers with the help of the dragon transformation art, his body was still wobbling, and he was unable to fly. At this critical moment, the huge sword suddenly paused. It was unknown whether it was because Zhang Yuha's sword cultivation was not high enough, or if there was some other unforeseen event. In short, it paused for a moment, and the force that tightly imprisoned Xiaohua suddenly loosened. With a swoosh, Xiaohua's figure suddenly flew back several meters. Immediately after, Xiaohua waved his hand again, and like a fairy scattering flowers, the dozen or so fire talismans scattered around the huge sword. The huge sword only paused for a moment before flying up again. The dazzling sword light had already pierced through the dozen or so fire talismans. Rumble! Tyrannical pillars of fire soared from the surroundings of the huge sword, and in an instant, the entire sword was wrapped up. The sword light on the huge sword was extremely bright in the explosion of the fireball jade talismans. Even the flying momentum of the huge sword was blocked, and the sword force that was comparable to a nascent soul cultivator was also shaken by the jade talismans. Wung wung, the huge sword hummed loudly, as if Zhang Yuha was extremely angry. When the smoke cleared, the giant sword was revealed. Not only was the sword light smaller, even the size of the flying sword seemed to have shrunk. However, this was not the most important thing. The most important thing was that as soon as the giant sword appeared, a light that resembled a giant hand condensed in the air. Previously, the heaven and earth spiritual chi in the space had been absorbed by the giant sword. Now the silver light in the entire Buddhist gold great array was swaying and dragging. It was like stars chasing the moon as it rushed into the giant hand. Even the giant hand was covered in a layer of faint silver light. Nascent soul. Nascent soul's hand? Zhang Yuha turned pale with fright. How could she not know about this kind of sharp weapon that could deal with a nascent soul cultivator? Xiaohua's face showed a trace of satisfaction. The true essence in his body rushed into the nascent soul's hand like a flood. His meridians that had been tempered for a long time faintly felt a bit uncomfortable, but he couldn't not urge it. This was one of his few trump cards. Woo! The nascent soul's hand streaked across the air again, and with the same power as the huge sword just now, a kind of earth-shattering confinement power covered the 5 fingers. Moreover, the 5 fingers were flashing with a silver light, looking extremely sharp. Wang, at this time, Zhang Yuha didn't have any other choice. She slightly raised the huge sword, and a deep blue sword light flashed. The sword chi on the huge sword first hit the nascent soul's hand. See la la! The sword chi collided with the silver light on the huge hand, and sparks flew everywhere. The violent fluctuation covered the surrounding several dozen feet of space. This was just the beginning. Rumble. Compared to any of the previous magic attacks, the roaring sound shook the entire space. Xiao Hua's figure was jolted up and down by the whole air. His figure was simply unable to stand. Not to mention that the chaotic airwaves stirred up everything in the space. Even the subversive fluctuation wiped out all of the magic power. At the same time Xiao Hua's figure was tilted, the qi and blood in his body were surging. It was as if he was hit by a big hammer, rolling all over. Compared to the pure absorption of the blood sacrifice array just now, it made him feel even more uncomfortable. So much so that there was a faint tearing feeling in his meridians. This was the result of the nascent soul's hand extracting the true essence from his meridians. Xiao Hua was in such a sorry state, but Zhang Yuha also didn't feel good. Xiao Hua's nascent soul's hand was comparable to a nascent soul's attack. That powerful confinement power collided with her sword. When the 5 fingers closed, the sword light on the huge sword was easily wiped away like iron shavings on a magnet. The sword heart that had yet to truly condense shook violently, and a part of the sword intent actually transformed into some tiny lotus flowers that floated inside the huge sword. It even flew out of the huge sword and transformed into bursts of sword qi. The sword qi became denser, but the huge sword also slightly shrunk. Zhang Yuha was furious. The huge sword trembled again, and a deep blue sword light rolled up like a waterfall. Like a whirlwind sweeping away clouds, it once again chopped towards the nascent soul's hand that still hadn't retracted. Too ferocious. Xiao Hua's figure still hadn't stabilized. Seeing Zhang Yuha attack again, he sighed in his heart. With a wave of his hand, more than 10 fire talismans were thrown out. Once again, he exerted himself to form a seal. The nascent soul's hand slowly flew back and wrapped around Xiao Hua. Go! Xiao Hua saw more than 10 fireballs explode, causing the huge sword to sway again. He hurriedly urged the nascent soul's hand, wanting to avoid the sword light that was about to chop down in front of him. But at this moment, ka-ka! A few sounds like glass breaking resounded in the distance. This sound wasn't loud, but in Zhang Yuha's ears, it was almost like a thunderclap. Although she was fighting with Xiao Hua, she still paid attention to this place. As long as there was a trace of movement here, she could clearly see it. Zhang Yuha almost didn't hesitate. With a turn of the sword light, the entire flying sword turned towards the 2 sword gourds, one green and one red. At this moment, the red sword gourd rapidly expanded and shrunk. The crimson sword light pierced through the air at an extremely fast speed. The gourd, which had already mostly transformed into the jade system, revealed a ferocious expression. The 6 directions yang spirit, which was in the form of the jade system, kept trembling as if it was sick. Every time it trembled, a faint layer of bloody light would fall off the yang spirit. Not good. Zhang Yuha's figure came out of the huge sword. Her body rolled, and the 2 sword spirits were wrapped in sword light. At the same time, Zhang Yuha pointed her finger, and a deep blue sword light rushed into the glabella of the 6 directions yang spirit. This sword light was very useful. In an instant, the 6 directions yang spirit stopped trembling. Even the blood light condensed on the surface of the 6 directions yang spirit's body. However, the sword gourd's expansion was even faster. It was as if Yutong's stomach was constantly inflating and deflating. Zhang Yuha's gaze swept past Xiao Hua. At this moment, Xiao Hua was hiding in the hand of the nascent soul, and flying towards the edge of the Brahma gold array. It was as if he wanted to take advantage of the time when Zhang Yuha was taking care of the sword spirits to tear open the Brahma gold array's weakness. Humph! Zhang Yuha coldly snorted and no longer paid attention to Xiao Hua. She patted her forehead, and a faint blue crystal thread slowly appeared. It was like a tentacle that pierced towards the glabella of the 6 directions sword spirit. The crystal thread touched the 6 directions sword spirit and immediately fused with it. However, the scarlet color instantly dyed the front part of the crystal thread red. It was even approaching the other end of the crystal thread. At the same time, she waved her hand again. The 2 balls of light, one green and one red, flew up and floated high above her head. At this moment, the 2 balls of light were the same as before. The 2 red and green crystal threads were connected, and countless sword runes were flowing freely inside them. It was as if there was another world inside. When the two balls of light landed above the yin-yang gourd, Zhang Yuhe seemed to hesitate. She looked at Xiao Hua, who had already escaped, and the red sword gourd. She clenched her teeth. After all, the great yin-yang sword spirit was her lifelong wish, and because she had refined it, she had stepped into the sword transformation realm. Now that there was a problem with the 6 directions yang sword spirit and the extreme yang sword gourd, she couldn't bear to give up. Since Xiao Hua had already dodged in the face of danger, she could use some secret techniques. Speed was like a cultivator chanting a mantra. Zhang Yuhe chanted a few words and her life sword flew out. With a puff, it stabbed into the crimson ball of light. The small sword gradually turned into a rainbow with 5 colors. As the 5 colors flickered, it gradually turned azure. When it was completely azure, it gradually became transparent and a thick crystal thread appeared. One end of the crystal thread stirred in the scarlet light and gradually turned red. The other end extended out and entered the azure ball of light. However, the crystal thread didn't enter. Instead, it passed through the ball of light and pulled out, landing on Zhang Yuhe's glabella. Chapter 26:12. Hiss. A sound similar to cold water being poured into a pot of oil sounded. The crystal thread entered the space between Zhang Yuhe's eyebrows, causing ripples to appear. Zhang Yuhe's face revealed a rare expression of pain. Woo, woo. The 2 balls of light began to revolve again. The woo-woo sound was soft to loud, and the entire space was filled with extremely intense sword light. At this time, Xiao Hua had already flown to the edge of the Buddhist gold great array. Seeing that Zhang Yuhe didn't chase after him, he was delighted. He urged his nascent soul to grab at the silver brilliance. The silver brilliance was like a torn piece of white cloth, tearing a small crack. Xiao Hua's figure didn't hesitate. He put away the talisman and drilled into the crack, wanting to escape with his life. At this time, a loud roar came from Zhang Yuhe's location. It was so loud that it shook the surroundings, covering the sword cry of the ball of light. "Oh, there really is someone else." Xiao Hua was slightly stunned. He thought of the previous situation where the silver tiger was about to turn into a rainbow. It must be the work of a fallen gold mountain disciple inside the Buddhist gold great array. However, this disciple was really patient. He waited until now to make a move. However, when Xiao Hua scanned with his divine sense, although he already had a certain idea, when he saw this person, he couldn't help but be dumbfounded. This was because this person was none other than Yu Tong. Yu Qingtian, Xiao Hua, and even Zhang Yuhe believed that Yu Tong had already been refined into a 6 directions yang spirit. At this time, Yu Tong had appeared above the scarlet ball of light. A 200-foot-long silver tiger figure occupied the top of his head. The figure bared its fangs and brandished its claws in an extremely insolent manner. This tiger figure was different from an ordinary tiger. 2 fleshy wings extended from the sides of the silver tiger's ribs. They slowly danced, and a faintly discernible silver light slowly rippled along with these fleshy wings. You. Zhang Yuhe was even more surprised than Xiao Hua. Haven't you been refined into a sword spirit? Ha ha ha. If I were to be refined into a sword spirit, would you still be able to see me? Yu Tong laughed sinisterly. Zhang Yuhe's crystal thread was still connected to his glabella. However, the true tiger celestial body spat out a silver brilliance from its mouth and firmly imprisoned the crystal thread. Yu Tong laughed sinisterly. Zhang Yuhe's crystal thread was still connected to his glabella. However, above his glabella, the true tiger celestial body spat out a silver brilliance that firmly imprisoned the crystal thread. I didn't expect you to be so patient. Your great-grandfather was killed by me, and your great blood sacrifice formation was overturned by me. Yet, you still didn't take action. Until now when she said this, Zhang Yuhe's expression changed slightly. Could it be you? You actually comprehended the great yin-yang 6 directions sword spirit? More than that, Yu Tong looked as if he had a card up his sleeve. He stretched out his hand and slapped his forehead. The pressure was released and rose steadily until it reached the peak of the late gold core stage. Zhang Yuhe was stunned again. You didn't expect this, did you? I'm not a Foundation establishment cultivator at all. Ha ha. Yu Tong was very appreciative of Zhang Yuha's astonishment. But I still have to thank you. You've saved me hundreds of years of hard work and promoted me to the late stage of Jindan realm with only a few blood sacrifices. That's not right. Zhang Yuha shook her head helplessly. When I saw you, you were definitely only a qi refinement cultivator. It was impossible for you to be in the Foundation establishment stage. Hearing this, Yu Tong said proudly, that's right. I was a qi refinement level 10 cultivator at that time. However, so what? Can't I cultivate to the Foundation establishment stage, or the gold core stage? My Dao sect has countless secret techniques. How can a mere swordsman like you know about my aptitude? Zhang Yuha's face was ashen. Her gaze fell on the crystal thread on Yu Tong's forehead, and the silver light in the true tiger celestial body's mouth. She said fiercely, Did you already have a plan? Or did you already have a plan with your great-grandfather, and waited until now to make things difficult for me? When this sword refined you into a 6 directions yang spirit. That's right. Yu Tong admitted without hesitation. I already knew that you would have a backup plan after refining the 6 directions yang spirit. Therefore, I hid my cultivation long ago and took action when you let your guard down. However, I didn't expect that today would be so lively. An old friend that I haven't seen for decades actually appeared in the Buddhist gold great array. Moreover, his cultivation is far beyond what I expected. Saying this, Yu Tong coldly swept his gaze over Xiaohua in the distance. Damn it, so this guy is the one who wanted to take away the silver tiger. So this Yu Tong is the one with the heavenly aptitude that Fairy Hongxia mentioned. This guy. His scheming is too powerful. Xiaohua instantly understood everything. Thinking of the silver tiger in the space, he secretly cursed in his heart. Go. Without hesitation, Xiaohua rushed into the gap in a flash, wanting to escape from the Buddhist gold great array as soon as possible. Seeing Xiaohua escape, Yu Tong didn't care at all. The true tiger celestial body flapped its wings, and completely silver light flashed from them. Woo! It was as if the sea had turned into mulberry fields, and the surrounding space changed. The silver light was like lightning, sealing off the area within 1,000 feet. There wasn't even a trace of heaven and earth spiritual energy. You can actually control the Buddhist gold great array? Zhang Yuha moaned and asked. Do you think Yu Qingtian is the sect master? Yu Tong sneered. After the 4th blood sacrifice, he already passed the position of sect master to you. If it weren't for the fact that he wanted to hide it from you, would you have called him great-grandfather? I can control the Buddhist gold great array without using the silver tiger. It's easier than using my own arms. As he spoke, a silver light appeared on Yu Tong's forehead. Within the silver light, there was a hint of crimson. The crimson light mixed with the silver light meandered along the azure crystal thread and flowed to the space between Zhang Yuha's eyebrows. Even the crimson crystal thread that was mixed with the azure crystal thread gradually grew larger, wrapping tightly around the azure crystal thread. Zhang Yuha sighed inwardly. She had a bad feeling in her heart. Everything Yu Tong did was her plan from the very beginning. It was her plan to refine Yu Tong, a Foundation establishment cultivator, into a 6 directions yang spirit. Now it all fell on her. Buzz! Zhang Yuha's body trembled. Her sword radiance flashed everywhere, as if she was about to make a final struggle. Roar! The true tiger celestial body roared angrily. A wave of silver light shot out of its mouth and landed on Zhang Yuha's forehead. In an instant it penetrated her body, and Zhang Yuha's sword radiance immediately dissipated. Zhang Yuha, don't struggle anymore. Yu Tong's body flashed as the silver light shot down and landed in front of Zhang Yuha. He reached out his hand and pressed his thumb on Zhang Yuha's forehead. A small imprint appeared on her forehead. In order to condense the sword heart, you didn't have much sword chi in your body. After that, you fought with Feng and your sword chi was depleted. In the end, you transformed into a sword and clashed with a nascent soul cultivator. Your sword heart has already been shaken. You're now a candle in the wind. What are you trying to do? Yu Tong landed in the distance and said coldly, that damned Feng may be powerful, but she still doesn't know your background. If you fight for a while longer, what else can you do? Zhang Yuha struggled with all her might. Her body seemed to be nailed to the ground in midair. She couldn't move at all. Moreover, her natal sword was controlled by Yutong. The sword chi around her didn't listen to her at all. She had the sword transformation realm, but she didn't have the means to transform into a sword. She was like a nascent soul cultivator who had lost his nascent soul. Don't struggle. Yutong pointed with his finger, and the crimson light on the crystal thread shone brightly. Through the crystal thread, a large amount of azure light fell. The azure light passed through Zhang Yuha's corporeal body and landed on the few remaining 6 directions in spirits below her. Roar. The 6 directions in spirit seemed to have consumed an elixir when it obtained the azure light. Its sword chi shone brightly. Speed. Yutong's eyes flashed with a blood-red color, and the fragments of the blood-red crystal split into 2. One of them rushed into the 6 directions in spirit, and the sword light around the in spirit gradually turned blood-red from the root. Go! Yutong pointed his finger. The 6 directions in spirit flew up and pounced on Zhang Yuha. Hee, refining the great yin-yang 6 directions sword spirit is your lifelong wish. Then you shall be the main soul of this 6 directions in spirit, and live in this extreme in sword gourd forever. Yutong laughed sinisterly. If a swordsman who has stepped into the sword transformation realm becomes the main soul of the 6 directions in spirit, it will be very easy for this young master's great yin-yang 6 directions sword spirit to kill the sword transformation realm. Seeing her consciousness gradually blurring, Zhang Yuha knew that her sword spirit was gradually being devoured by the 6 directions sword spirit. These 2 sword spirits came from the same source. It was extremely easy to devour them. Her sword intent was firmly controlled by Yutong. The sword origin in her body was also imprisoned by the silver light. Zhang Yuha could only be a fish on the chopping board. You want me to surrender without a fight? You're underestimating the warriors of my sword domain. A trace of contempt appeared on Zhang Yuha's face. However, her eyes looked past Yutong to the silver light in the sky. She muttered, "Elder sister, where are you? It's all because I'm too greedy and too selfish. If I only wanted to avenge you and send a message to the sect, how would I end up in this state? I hope that elder sister can turn misfortune into fortune. The heavens bless my sword region." As she spoke, a small grayish-black sword suddenly appeared on Zhang Yuha's forehead. There was no sword light or sword chi from the small sword. Furthermore, the small sword was faintly discernible. What is this? Yutong was stunned. He also had a vague feeling that something was wrong. Kill. Zhang Yuha spat out a single word. The small sword flew out silently. In the blink of an eye, it pierced into Yutong's forehead. Yutong hurriedly activated the golden light protecting his body. Unfortunately, the golden light was unable to block the small sword. The small sword sank into his forehead. Yutong touched his unharmed forehead. He was extremely puzzled. However, immediately after, Yutong felt an incomparable pain in the depths of his soul. Soul sword? Yutong suddenly realized that this was the soul sword that he had occasionally heard Zhang Yuha mention. A heart-wrenching scream came from Yutong's mouth. Instantly, Yutong tilted above the ball of light. The silver-white true tiger celestial body also quietly returned to his body. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.